Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most chilling cases to emerge from suburban Chicago, a story that spans 2 decades and involves 2 women, 2 mysterious deaths, and 1 man who wore a badge but may have been the very danger he was sworn to protect against. This is the story of Drew Peterson, a charismatic police sergeant whose charm masked a darker reality. It's the story of Kathleen Savio, whose warnings about her ex-husband went unheeded until it was too late. And it's the story of Stacy Peterson, a young mother who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a community forever changed. Tonight, we'll explore how one woman's disappearance finally brought justice for another woman's death, and how the wheels of justice sometimes turn slowly, but they do turn. To understand this case, we must first understand the man at its center. Drew Walter Peterson was born on January 5, 1954, in the suburbs of Chicago. From an early age, he displayed the kind of confidence that would later serve him well in law enforcement, and perhaps, in darker pursuits. Peterson joined the Bolingbrook Police Department in 1977, when he was just 23 years old. Bolingbrook was a growing suburb, the kind of place where families moved for good schools and safe neighborhoods. Peterson seemed to embody everything residents wanted in a police officer. He was tall, well-built, confident, and had an easy smile that put people at ease. Over the years, Peterson climbed the ranks, eventually becoming a sergeant. He was known for his sense of humor, his ability to defuse tense situations, and his dedication to the job. Fellow officers described him as someone who could walk into a room and immediately command attention. He had that kind of magnetic personality that drew people to him. But there was another side to Drew Peterson, one that became more apparent as the years passed. He was a man who seemed to have an unusual relationship with marriage. By the time he was in his 40s, he had already been married twice and divorced twice. His first marriage, to Carol Brown, lasted from 1974 to 1980. His second marriage, to Victoria Connolly, lasted from 1982 to 1992. Those who knew Peterson during these years described him as charming but controlling. He had strong opinions about how things should be done, and he wasn't shy about expressing them. Some former colleagues would later say that Peterson had a way of making his presence known. He was the kind of person who filled a room, for better or worse. In 1992, Peterson met Kathleen Savio. She was a beautiful, vibrant woman who worked as an accountant. Friends described her as warm, funny, and devoted to her family. She seemed to be exactly what Peterson was looking for, or so it appeared at the time. Kathleen Savio was born on March 25, 1963, making her about 9 years younger than Drew Peterson. She grew up in a close-knit Italian-American family in the Chicago suburbs. Her family and friends remember her as someone who lit up every room she entered. She had an infectious laugh and a way of making everyone around her feel special. Kathy, as she was known to friends, was intelligent and ambitious. She had built a successful career as an accountant and was known for her attention to detail and her ability to solve complex problems. She was also deeply family-oriented, maintaining close relationships with her siblings and parents throughout her life. When Kathy met Drew Peterson in 1992, she was immediately drawn to his confidence and charm. Here was a police officer, someone who served and protected the community, who seemed to adore her. Peterson could be incredibly romantic when he wanted to be, and during their courtship, he pulled out all the stops. He sent flowers, planned elaborate dates, and made Kathy feel like the most important person in the world. They married on May 3, 1992, in a ceremony that friends described as beautiful and joyful. Kathy seemed genuinely happy, and those who knew her well hoped that she had found the stability and love she deserved. The early years of their marriage seemed promising. They bought a home in Bolingbrook, and Kathy threw herself into the role of stepmother to Peterson's children from his previous marriages. But as the years passed, cracks began to appear in their relationship. Friends and family members later recalled that Kathy began to seem more stressed, more on edge. She would make comments about Peterson's controlling behavior, how he wanted to know where she was at all times, how he didn't like her spending time with certain friends, how he had strong opinions about everything from what she wore to how she spent her money. Peterson's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was known to show up at Kathy's workplace unexpectedly, claiming he was just checking in. He would interrogate her about her daily activities with the thoroughness of a police investigation. What might have seemed like concern to an outsider felt suffocating to Kathy. The situation deteriorated further when Peterson began having an affair. In 2001, while still married to Kathy, he met Stacey Callis, a 17-year-old hotel receptionist. Stacey was young, impressionable, and seemingly impressed by Peterson's position as a police officer. The affair continued for several years, with Peterson leading a double life, playing the devoted husband at home while pursuing a relationship with a teenager. When Kathy discovered the affair, she was devastated. This wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage vows, it was a betrayal of everything she thought she knew about the man she had married. She filed for divorce in October 2001, beginning what would become a bitter, contentious legal battle. The divorce proceedings revealed a side of Peterson that few people had seen before. He could be vindictive, manipulative, and cruel. He fought Kathy on every single issue: child support, division of assets, custody arrangements. What should have been a straightforward divorce became a years-long ordeal that consumed Kathy's life and drained her emotionally and financially. During this time, Kathy began confiding in friends and family about her fears. She told them that she was afraid of Peterson, that she believed he was capable of violence. She said that he had threatened her, that he had made comments about how easy it would be for someone to have an accident. These weren't vague concerns, they were specific fears about a man who knew how to investigate crimes and might know how to commit them. By 2004, the divorce between Drew Peterson and Kathleen Savio had been finalized for over a year, but the acrimony continued. Peterson was ordered to pay substantial alimony and child support, and he resented every dollar. He had already married Stacey Callis in a ceremony that took place just days after his divorce from Kathy was finalized, a timeline that spoke to how long the affair had been going on. Kathy, meanwhile, was trying to rebuild her life. She had started dating again and seemed to be finding some happiness after the long, difficult divorce. But she never stopped worrying about Peterson. She told friends that she felt like he was watching her, that she never felt completely safe. On February 29, 2004, those fears would prove tragically prophetic. It was a Sunday evening when Peterson called the Bolingbrook Police Department to report that he couldn't reach Kathy. He said he was supposed to pick up their children, but she wasn't answering her phone or the door. He asked for a welfare check, claiming to be a concerned ex-husband who just wanted to make sure she was okay. When officers arrived at Kathy's townhouse on Pheasant Chase Court, they found the front door unlocked. They entered the home and began searching. The house was quiet, eerily so. They called out Kathy's name but received no response. They found her in the master bathroom, lying face down in the dry bathtub. She was wearing a white t-shirt and underwear, and her body was in a position that would become a source of controversy for years to come. Her head was at the faucet end of the tub, and there was a small laceration on the back of her head. The responding officers immediately called for paramedics and investigators. The scene was photographed and documented, but the investigation that followed would later be criticized as inadequate and rushed. The initial investigation was led by the Illinois State Police, since Peterson was a member of the local police force and a conflict of interest was obvious. However, the investigation seemed to lack the thoroughness that such a suspicious death warranted. The investigators noted the head wound and the fact that Kathy's hair was damp, suggesting she had been in the process of bathing when she died. The working theory was that Kathy had slipped and fallen in the tub, striking her head on the faucet and drowning in the shallow water. It was presented as a tragic accident, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. But there were several aspects of the scene that didn't quite fit this theory. The tub was dry when police arrived, with no standing water. If Kathy had drowned, where had the water gone? The position of her body also seemed unusual. She was lying lengthwise in the tub, which would be an unusual position for someone who had simply slipped and fallen. More concerning was the fact that Kathy was an experienced swimmer who was comfortable in water. She had grown up swimming and had never shown any fear of bathing or being in water. Would someone with her experience and comfort level really drown in a bathtub, even if she had hit her head? The coroner, Dr. Brian Mitchell, ruled the death an accident. He concluded that Kathy had suffered a laceration to the back of her head, likely from hitting the faucet, and had subsequently drowned in the tub. The ruling was based on the physical evidence at the scene and the apparent lack of any signs of a struggle. But Kathy's family was not convinced. They had heard her fears about Peterson, her concerns about what he might do to her. They knew about the bitter divorce, the threats, the controlling behavior. To them, the timing of her death, just when she was starting to rebuild her life, seemed too convenient to be a coincidence. The family hired their own attorney and began pushing for a more thorough investigation. They pointed out that Peterson, as a police officer, would have known exactly how to stage a scene to look like an accident. They questioned why there was no water in the tub and why Kathy's hair was only damp, not soaked as it would be if she had been underwater. But their concerns were dismissed. The official cause of death remained accidental drowning, and the case was closed. Peterson, meanwhile, seemed to move on with his life. He collected on Kathy's life insurance policy and continued his marriage to Stacy, who was now pregnant with their first child. For 3 years, it seemed like Peterson had gotten away with what Kathy's family believed was murder. The case was closed, the insurance money was collected, and life went on. But sometimes, justice takes time, and sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places. Stacy Ann Callis was born on January 20, 1984, making her exactly 30 years younger than Drew Peterson. She grew up in a working-class family in the Chicago suburbs, and by all accounts, she was a typical teenager. She liked music, movies, and spending time with friends. She was also incredibly young and perhaps more impressionable than she realized. When Stacy met Peterson in 2001, she was just 17 years old and working as a hotel receptionist. Peterson was 47, married, and a respected police officer. To a teenage girl, he probably seemed sophisticated and worldly. He had stories to tell, a stable job, and the kind of confidence that can be very appealing to someone who is still figuring out who they are. The relationship began as an affair while Peterson was still married to Kathy. Stacy later told friends that she didn't fully understand the implications of what she was doing. She was a teenager in love with an older man who made her feel special and important. She didn't think about the wife at home or the children who would be affected by their relationship. When Peterson's divorce from Kathy was finalized in 2003, he wasted no time in marrying Stacy. The ceremony took place on October 18, 2003, just days after the divorce was official. Stacy was 19 years old and pregnant with their first child. She was about to become a stepmother to Peterson's older children and was trying to navigate a complex family situation that would have been challenging for someone twice her age. The early years of their marriage seemed happy enough. Stacy gave birth to their son, Anthony, in 2003, and their daughter, Lacey, in 2005. Peterson appeared to be a devoted father and husband, and those who knew the family described them as seemingly normal. Stacy threw herself into the role of mother and stepmother, trying to create a stable home for all the children. But as time passed, Stacy began to see sides of Peterson that she hadn't noticed when she was a teenager. She realized that the confidence she had found so attractive could quickly turn into arrogance and control. Peterson had strong opinions about how she should dress, who she should spend time with, and how she should raise their children. Friends and family members later recalled that Stacy began to seem more isolated as the years went by. Peterson didn't like her going out with friends, and he often found reasons why she couldn't attend family gatherings or social events. He wanted to know where she was at all times and would often call or text her repeatedly when she was out of the house. The situation became more complicated after Kathy Savio's death in 2004. While the death had been ruled an accident, Stacy was not blind to the timing or the circumstances. She had been the other woman during Peterson's marriage to Kathy, and she had witnessed firsthand how vindictive he could be during the divorce proceedings. As the years passed, Stacy began to have doubts about the official story of Kathy's death. She started asking Peterson questions about that night, about what had happened, about why Kathy had died so suddenly. According to later testimony, Peterson eventually confided in her about what had really happened to Kathy, and what he told her was not the story of an accidental drowning. By 2007, Stacy's marriage to Peterson was in serious trouble. She had grown from a naive teenager into a young woman who was beginning to understand that she had married a man who was not what he seemed. She began talking to friends about leaving Peterson, about taking the children and starting over somewhere else. She also began talking about what she knew about Kathy's death. She told close friends that she believed Peterson had killed his third wife, and she hinted that she had information that could prove it. She said she was considering going to the police, but she was afraid of what Peterson might do if he found out. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous for Stacy. She was trapped in a marriage with a man she now feared, and she possessed information that could destroy him. She was also the mother of 2 young children, which made the idea of leaving both more urgent and more complicated. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Stacy began making preparations to leave. She talked to a divorce attorney and began putting aside money. She told her sister, Cassandra, about her plans and asked her to help her find a place to live. She seemed to be gathering the courage to take the step that would free her from Peterson once and for all. But on October 28, 2007, before she could put her plans into action, Stacy Peterson disappeared. October 28, 2007, started like any other Sunday for the Peterson family. Stacy, now 23 years old, had made plans to help her sister paint her apartment. It was the kind of ordinary family activity that Stacy looked forward to, a chance to spend time with her sister and escape the increasingly tense atmosphere at home. But Stacy never showed up at her sister's apartment. When Cassandra called to ask where she was, Peterson answered the phone. He seemed calm, almost casual, as he explained that Stacy had left him. He said she had called him that morning to say she was leaving him for another man and that she was going away for a while to think about what she wanted to do. The story didn't make sense to Cassandra. Stacy had been planning to help her paint that day, and she would never have stood her up without calling. More importantly, Stacy would never have left her 2 young children, Anthony and Lacey, who were just 4 and 2 years old. She was a devoted mother who had never been away from her children for more than a few hours. When Cassandra pressed Peterson for more details about where Stacy had gone and when she might be back, his answers were vague and inconsistent. He claimed that Stacy had mentioned running away with someone she had met, but he couldn't provide any specifics about who this person was or where they might have gone. That evening, when Stacy still hadn't returned or called, her family became increasingly worried. They called Peterson repeatedly, but he seemed unconcerned. He told them that Stacy was an adult and that she had made her choice to leave. He said he wasn't going to chase after her or beg her to come back. The family's concerns deepened when they realized that Stacy had left behind not just her children, but also her personal belongings. Her purse, her cell phone, her identification, and her clothes were all still at the house. If she had really left with another man, why hadn't she taken any of her things? By Monday morning, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. Stacy's family contacted the Bolingbrook Police Department to report her missing. The police response was initially lukewarm. They seemed to accept Peterson's story that his wife had left him and would probably return when she was ready. But as hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks, it became clear that Stacy Peterson had not left voluntarily. She had not taken any money from their joint bank accounts. She had not contacted her family or friends. She had simply vanished without a trace. The case began to attract media attention, partly because of the unusual circumstances and partly because of Peterson's behavior. Instead of appearing as a worried husband desperately searching for his missing wife, Peterson seemed almost relieved. He gave interviews to reporters in which he appeared calm and collected, sometimes even making jokes about the situation. Peterson's behavior struck many people as strange and inappropriate. He seemed more concerned with defending his reputation than with finding his wife. He repeatedly insisted that Stacy had left him voluntarily and that she would probably return when she was ready. He even suggested that the media attention was preventing her from coming home. But those who knew Stacy well were convinced that something terrible had happened to her. They knew she would never have left her children voluntarily, and they knew she would never have disappeared without telling anyone where she was going. As the search for Stacy intensified, investigators began to take a closer look at Peterson's history. They discovered his previous marriages, his contentious divorce from Kathy, and the circumstances surrounding Kathy's death. They also learned about the domestic violence allegations and the restraining orders that had been filed against him over the years. The investigation into Stacy's disappearance was about to uncover secrets that had been buried for years, and it would finally bring justice for another woman who had tried to warn the world about Drew Peterson. The disappearance of Stacy Peterson changed everything. What had been a closed case suddenly became the focus of intense scrutiny, and investigators began to see connections they had missed before. The Illinois State Police formed a task force to investigate Stacy's disappearance, and almost immediately, they began to question the circumstances surrounding Kathy Savio's death. The timing was too convenient to ignore. Peterson's third wife had died under suspicious circumstances, and now his fourth wife had vanished without a trace. The task force was led by investigators who were not connected to the original investigation of Kathy's death. They brought fresh eyes and new technology to a case that had been closed for 3 years. They began by re-examining the crime scene photos and autopsy reports from 2004, looking for details that might have been overlooked. What they found was troubling. The original investigation had been rushed and incomplete. There had been no thorough examination of the scene, no careful documentation of the evidence, and no serious consideration of the possibility that Kathy's death might have been a homicide rather than an accident. The investigators also began interviewing people who had known both Kathy and Peterson. They spoke to friends, family members, co-workers, and neighbors, building a picture of a relationship that had been marked by control, intimidation, and fear. One of the most significant developments came when investigators began talking to Stacy's friends and relatives about what she had told them in the months before her disappearance. They learned that Stacy had been planning to leave Peterson and that she had been afraid of what he might do to her. More importantly, they learned that Stacy had confided in several people about what she knew about Kathy's death. According to these witnesses, Stacy had told them that Peterson had confessed to killing Kathy, and she had provided details about how he had done it. This was explosive information, but it presented a significant legal challenge. Stacy was missing and presumed dead, which meant she couldn't testify about what Peterson had allegedly told her. Under normal circumstances, her statements would be considered hearsay and would not be admissible in court. But Illinois had recently passed a law known as Drew's Law, which was specifically designed to address situations like this. The law allowed certain hearsay statements to be admitted in court if the witness was unavailable due to the defendant's actions. In other words, if Peterson had killed Stacy to prevent her from testifying, her previous statements about his confession could potentially be used against him. Meanwhile, the investigation into Stacy's disappearance continued. Police searched the Peterson home, the surrounding area, and various locations where Peterson might have disposed of a body. They used cadaver dogs, sonar equipment, and ground-penetrating radar, but they found no trace of Stacy. The search efforts were complicated by Peterson's behavior. He seemed to enjoy the media attention and often inserted himself into the investigation in ways that were both helpful and suspicious. He would make comments to reporters that seemed designed to throw investigators off the scent, and he would sometimes appear at search sites to observe the proceedings. Peterson's demeanor during this period was particularly striking. While his wife was missing and presumed dead, he seemed almost jovial. He gave numerous interviews to television reporters, and he often appeared to be enjoying the attention. He would make jokes, smile for the cameras, and generally behave in a way that seemed inappropriate for a man whose wife had disappeared. This behavior only heightened suspicions about his involvement in both cases. The investigators began to build a timeline of Peterson's activities on the days surrounding both Kathy's death and Stacy's disappearance. They interviewed his co-workers, his friends, and his family members, looking for any inconsistencies in his story. They also began to examine Peterson's knowledge of police procedures and forensic science. As a police officer, he would have understood how crime scenes were processed and what evidence investigators would look for. This knowledge could have helped him stage Kathy's death to look like an accident and dispose of Stacy's body in a way that would make it difficult to find. The investigation was painstaking and complex, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and hundreds of hours of interviews, searches, and analysis. But gradually, a picture began to emerge of a man who had used his position and his knowledge to commit the perfect crimes, or so he thought. By 2008, the investigation into both cases was gaining momentum. The Illinois State Police had assembled a team of experienced investigators, forensic experts, and prosecutors who were determined to seek justice for both Kathy Savio and Stacy Peterson. The first major breakthrough came when investigators decided to exhume Kathy's body for a second autopsy. The original autopsy had been conducted in 2004, and the pathologist had concluded that the death was accidental. But with new questions being raised about the circumstances of her death, investigators wanted a fresh examination by a different pathologist. The exhumation took place on November 16, 2007, nearly 4 years after Kathy's death. The body was transported to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office, where it was examined by Dr. Brian Mitchell, the same pathologist who had performed the original autopsy. But this time, Dr. Mitchell had additional information to consider. He knew about the domestic violence allegations, the threats Peterson had made, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Stacy's disappearance. He also had access to more detailed crime scene photos and reports that had been compiled by the new investigative team. The results of the second autopsy were dramatically different from the first. Dr. Mitchell changed his ruling from accidental death to homicide. He concluded that Kathy had been the victim of a homicidal drowning, and that her death was consistent with being held underwater until she drowned. The pathologist found evidence of struggle that had not been noted in the original examination. There were scratches and bruises on Kathy's body that suggested she had fought against her attacker. The position of her body in the tub was also more consistent with someone who had been placed there after death rather than someone who had fallen and drowned. This new ruling was a game-changer for the investigation. Kathy's death was now officially a murder, which meant that Peterson could be charged with her killing. But prosecutors still needed to build a case that would convince a jury of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The case was complicated by the fact that there were no eyewitnesses to the crime and no direct physical evidence linking Peterson to the scene. The prosecution would have to rely on circumstantial evidence, including the testimony of people who had heard Peterson make threats against Kathy and the hearsay statements from Stacy about Peterson's alleged confession. The prosecutors also had to deal with the fact that Peterson was a police officer who was familiar with the legal system and had access to experienced attorneys. He would not be an easy defendant to convict, and his legal team would undoubtedly challenge every piece of evidence and every witness statement. But the prosecution team was confident that they had enough evidence to proceed. They had the new autopsy results, the testimony of numerous witnesses about Peterson's threatening behavior, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding both deaths. They also had the benefit of Peterson's own statements to the media, which often contradicted his official story and made him appear callous and unconcerned about his missing wife. In May 2009, Drew Peterson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. The arrest came more than 5 years after her death and nearly 2 years after Stacy's disappearance. Peterson was taken into custody at his home in Bolingbrook, and he was denied bail due to the serious nature of the charges and the risk that he might flee. The arrest was a major milestone in the case, but it was just the beginning of a long legal battle that would test the limits of the justice system and the strength of the evidence against Peterson. The trial of Drew Peterson began on July 31, 2012, more than 8 years after Kathleen Savio's death and nearly 5 years after Stacy Peterson's disappearance. The case had attracted national attention, and the courthouse in Joliet, Illinois, was packed with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers. The prosecution, led by Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow, faced significant challenges. They had to prove that Peterson had murdered Kathy without any direct evidence linking him to the crime. Their case would rely heavily on circumstantial evidence and the controversial hearsay testimony about what Stacy had told friends and family about Peterson's alleged confession. The defense, led by attorney Joel Brodsky, argued that the prosecution's case was built on gossip and speculation rather than solid evidence. They maintained that Kathy's death was an accident, just as the original investigation had concluded, and that the charges against Peterson were the result of a rush to judgment driven by media pressure and public opinion. The trial lasted for several weeks and featured testimony from dozens of witnesses. The prosecution presented evidence about the couple's bitter divorce, the domestic violence allegations, and the threats Peterson had made against Kathy. They also called witnesses who testified about what Stacy had told them about Peterson's confession. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when the prosecution played recordings of Peterson's own statements to the media. In these interviews, Peterson had made comments that seemed to show a callous disregard for his missing wife and a suspicious knowledge of how investigations were conducted. The defense fought hard to exclude much of the hearsay evidence, arguing that it was unreliable and prejudicial. They pointed out that Stacy was not available to be cross-examined about her statements, and they argued that her claims about Peterson's confession were not credible. But the judge allowed most of the hearsay evidence to be admitted under the Drew's Law statute, which had been specifically designed to address situations where witnesses were unavailable due to the defendant's actions. The trial also featured testimony from forensic experts who explained how Kathy's death could have been staged to look like an accident. They described how someone with Peterson's knowledge of police procedures and crime scene investigation could have positioned the body and cleaned up the scene to support the accidental drowning theory. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict on September 6, 2012. They found Drew Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. The verdict was met with cheers from Kathy's family and supporters, who had waited more than 8 years for justice. Peterson was sentenced to 38 years in prison, which meant he would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The sentence was seen as a victory for the prosecution and a vindication of the decision to reopen the case after Stacy's disappearance. The conviction of Drew Peterson for the murder of Kathleen Savio was a significant victory for the justice system, but it also highlighted the tragic irony of the case. It was Stacy Peterson's disappearance that finally brought justice for Kathy's death, but Stacy herself has never been found. Despite extensive searches, she has never been found. Her children, Anthony and Lacey, have grown up without their mother, and her family continues to search for answers about what happened to her. Peterson's fourth wife, Stacy Peterson, has been missing since 2007. Recently, her sister Cassandra has claimed to have found what she believes are Stacy's remains in a canal, but authorities have not confirmed this discovery. The case has had a lasting impact on how domestic violence cases are investigated and prosecuted. It has shown how dangerous it can be when the person who is supposed to protect becomes the predator, and it has highlighted the importance of believing victims when they report threats and abuse. Peterson is now 70-years-old and continuing to push for this new trial where he could testify and maintain his innocence. He remains in prison, serving his sentence for Kathy's murder and additional time for attempting to hire someone to kill the prosecutor who convicted him. The story of Drew Peterson serves as a reminder that justice sometimes takes time, but it also shows that the truth has a way of emerging, even years after a crime has been committed. Two women paid the ultimate price for their involvement with a man who used his badge and his charm to hide his true nature, but their stories have not been forgotten. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Kathleen Savio and Stacy Peterson, two women whose lives were cut short but whose stories continue to resonate, reminding us of the importance of justice, truth, and the courage to speak out against those who would do us harm. The case may be closed for Kathy, but for Stacy, the search continues. And perhaps, someday, she too will find the justice she deserves. Please, if you're new here, welcome to our channel where we explore true crime stories in a calm, respectful manner. I want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. On a cold January morning in 2010, in the quiet suburban community of Conyers, Georgia, a 911 call would shatter the peaceful facade of a gated subdivision. The caller? A 16-year-old girl, her voice trembling with what seemed like genuine terror and confusion. "My mom is dead," the young voice reported to the emergency dispatcher. "We just got home from school and found her in the bathroom. There's blood everywhere." This wasn't just any mother-daughter relationship gone wrong. This was the beginning of one of the most disturbing familicide cases in Georgia's recent history. The victim was Jarmika Nikki Whitehead, a 34-year-old beautician who had been brutally murdered in her own home. The perpetrators? Her twin 16-year-old daughters, Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead. But this story doesn't begin with a crime. It begins with a family trying to find its way through a maze of custody battles, generational trauma, and a mother's desperate attempts to reconnect with daughters who had grown to resent her very existence. To understand what happened in that pristine suburban home on January 13, 2010, we must first understand the complicated history of the Whitehead family. Like many tragic stories, this one is built on a foundation of missed opportunities, misunderstandings, and the complex dynamics of a family that never quite found its rhythm. Jarmika Yvonne Whitehead, known to everyone as Nikki, was born into a world that would never be simple. By the time she was in her teens, she had already begun making choices that would ripple through the generations. When she gave birth to twin daughters, Jasmia and Tasmia, in 1993, she was young, unprepared, and, by most accounts, unable to provide the stability that children need. The twins, from their earliest days, were raised not by their mother, but by their great-grandmother, Della Frazier. This arrangement, while providing the girls with stability, created a complicated dynamic that would haunt the family for years to come. Della Frazier became more than a caretaker, she became the only mother figure the twins truly knew. Nikki's presence in her daughters' lives was, as Della would later describe it, sporadic and random. She would drift in and out of their lives like a beautiful but unpredictable storm. Sometimes she would be loving and attentive, bringing gifts and promises of a better future. Other times, she would disappear for weeks or months, leaving the girls to wonder why they weren't enough to keep their mother around. This pattern of abandonment and return created a complex psychological landscape for the twins. They craved their mother's attention but also resented her inconsistency. They wanted to love her but couldn't trust her. This internal conflict would grow more intense as the girls moved through their teenage years, eventually becoming a powder keg of resentment and anger. The twins themselves were inseparable. Born mere minutes apart, they seemed to share not just a birthday but a singular mind. They dressed alike, spoke in unison, and developed what psychologists call a twin bond that excluded almost everyone else from their inner circle. This bond, while natural for twins, would become problematic as they grew older and began to see the world as them against everyone else, including their mother. By 2007, when the twins were 13 years old, Nikki had stabilized her life to some degree. She had her own hair salon, a place in the community, and what appeared to be a renewed desire to be a mother to her daughters. This is when she made a decision that would set the stage for the tragic events to come. She petitioned for custody of the twins. From the outside, this seemed like a positive development. Here was a mother who had gotten her life together and wanted to reclaim her role as a parent. But the twins, who had never really known their mother as a stable presence, viewed this not as a homecoming but as an invasion. The legal battle that followed was complex and emotionally charged. Della Frazier, who had raised the girls from infancy, fought to maintain custody. She argued that she had provided the stability and consistency that the twins needed, and that removing them from her care would be traumatic and disruptive. The twins themselves were vocal in their opposition to moving in with their mother. But the court system, with its emphasis on reuniting children with their biological parents, ultimately sided with Nikki. The judge believed that she had demonstrated sufficient change in her life to warrant giving her another chance at motherhood. It was a decision made with the best of intentions, but it would have devastating consequences. From the moment the twins moved in with their mother, there was tension. The girls, who had been raised by their great-grandmother's traditional, disciplined approach, now found themselves living with a woman who seemed more like a peer than a parent. Nikki was young, attractive, and had a social life that included romantic relationships and recreational activities that the twins judged harshly. The cultural and generational gap between mother and daughters was wider than the Grand Canyon. Nikki, who had never really learned to be a mother, tried to befriend her daughters rather than parent them. She wanted to be the cool mom, the one who understood them and could relate to their teenage concerns. But the twins, who had been raised with structure and discipline, interpreted her attempts at friendship as weakness and hypocrisy. What began as typical teenage rebellion soon escalated into something far more sinister. The twins, united in their resentment of their mother, began to systematically undermine her authority. They refused to follow her rules, mocked her attempts at discipline, and openly challenged her right to parent them. The situation was complicated by the twins' perception of their mother's lifestyle. They saw her as hypocritical, someone who tried to impose rules on them while living what they considered to be an immoral lifestyle. According to later court documents, the twins were particularly critical of their mother's romantic relationships and her occasional use of marijuana. They saw these as evidence that she was not fit to be their mother. The conflicts between mother and daughters were not just verbal. By 2008, the disputes had escalated to physical altercations. In one particularly violent incident, the twins attacked their mother, leaving her with scratches and bruises. The attack was so severe that Nikki was literally dragged across the floor by her own daughters. This incident resulted in the twins being removed from their mother's custody and returned to their great-grandmother. The court ordered counseling for all three of them, hoping that professional intervention might help them work through their issues. But the damage to their relationship was becoming irreparable. During this period, the twins were also exhibiting behavioral problems at school. They were frequently truant, defiant toward authority figures, and seemed to operate as a unit against the world. Teachers and counselors noted that while they were intelligent and capable, they seemed to have little respect for rules or authority. The court system continued to try to find a way to make the family work. Despite the violence and the obvious dysfunction, there remained hope that with proper intervention, the mother-daughter relationship could be salvaged. Various arrangements were tried, including supervised visitation and structured family therapy. But the twins remained adamant in their opposition to living with their mother. They saw her as an intruder in their lives, someone who had given up her right to be their parent when she had abandoned them as children. They had formed their own family unit with their great-grandmother, and they didn't want or need Nikki's version of motherhood. Despite the documented violence and the obvious dysfunction in the family, the court made a decision that would prove to be fatal. On January 5, 2010, just 8 days before the murder, the court ordered that the twins be returned to their mother's custody. This time, it was supposed to be a 2-week trial period to see if the family could work through their issues. The decision was made with the best of intentions, but it ignored the reality of the situation. The twins had made it clear that they didn't want to live with their mother. They had previously resorted to violence when forced to live with her. And there was no indication that the underlying issues that had caused the previous problems had been resolved. The twins were vocal in their opposition to the court's decision. They protested the order, but they were minors with no legal standing to refuse. They were told that they would have to comply with the court's decision, regardless of their feelings about it. This period of time, from January 5 to January 13, 2010, was like a lit fuse slowly burning toward an explosion. The twins were living in what they saw as a prison, with a warden they neither respected nor loved. They were counting down the days until they could return to their great-grandmother's custody, but they were also building up a reservoir of anger and resentment that would soon find a violent outlet. During this week, there were multiple instances of conflict between the mother and her daughters. Neighbors later reported hearing arguments and shouting from the Whitehead home. The tension was palpable, and it seemed to be building toward some kind of confrontation. Nikki, for her part, was also struggling with the situation. She had fought for custody of her daughters, believing that she could create a loving family environment. But the reality was that she was living with 2 teenagers who actively despised her. Every interaction was a battle, every conversation was a potential conflict, and every day brought new challenges that she was not equipped to handle. January 13, 2010, began like any other school day in the Whitehead household. The twins were supposed to get ready for school, a routine that had become a daily battleground between them and their mother. But on this particular morning, the routine conflict would escalate into something unimaginable. The argument began, as it often did, with something mundane. The twins were running late for school, and their mother was trying to get them to hurry. But what started as a typical morning disagreement quickly escalated into something much more serious. According to the confessions that would later be extracted from the twins, the argument became heated when Nikki tried to assert her authority as their mother. She was tired of their disrespect, tired of their constant defiance, and tired of being treated like an enemy in her own home. She began lecturing them about their behavior and their attitude toward her. The twins, who had been building up resentment for weeks, finally reached their breaking point. They had been forced to live with a woman they saw as a hypocrite and a failure as a mother. They had been told by the court that they had to respect and obey someone they neither loved nor trusted. And on this morning, they decided they had had enough. The first blow was struck by one of the twins, who hit their mother with a vase. The blow was hard enough to stun Nikki, but it was just the beginning. In the frenzy that followed, both twins participated in a brutal attack on their mother. They stabbed her repeatedly with a knife, showing a level of violence that was shocking in its intensity. But the most disturbing detail of the attack was yet to come. In their rage, the twins didn't just stab their mother, they also bit her. This animalistic behavior suggested a level of fury that went beyond mere anger. It was as if they were trying to destroy not just their mother's body, but her very essence. The attack continued until Nikki was severely wounded and dying. At this point, the twins faced the reality of what they had done. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had committed the ultimate act of rebellion against their mother, they had killed her. With their mother mortally wounded, the twins now faced a different kind of problem. They had to decide what to do with the body and how to avoid being caught for their crime. In a move that showed both their criminal sophistication and their deep psychological bond, they worked together to cover up the murder. The twins dragged their mother's body to the bathroom and placed it in the bathtub. This wasn't just about hiding the body, it was about staging a scene that would make it look like their mother had been killed by an intruder. They positioned the body to suggest that she had been attacked by someone else, not by her own daughters. But the cover-up didn't stop there. The twins also had to create an alibi for themselves. They needed to establish that they were not at home when their mother was killed. So they left the house and went to school, acting as if nothing had happened. They attended classes, interacted with their classmates, and maintained the facade of normalcy. When the school day ended, the twins returned home and discovered their mother's body. This was when they made the 911 call, pretending to be shocked and horrified by what they had found. They told the dispatcher that they had just gotten home from school and found their mother dead in the bathroom. The performance was convincing enough to initially fool the responding officers. The twins appeared to be genuinely traumatized by the discovery of their mother's body. They cried, they seemed confused, and they gave statements that suggested they had no idea who could have done such a thing to their mother. But experienced investigators know that family members are often the most likely suspects in domestic homicides. While the twins were putting on their act of grief and confusion, the detectives were already beginning to look more closely at their story and their behavior. The investigation into Nikki Whitehead's murder began immediately after the discovery of her body. The Conyers Police Department, working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, launched a comprehensive investigation into what appeared to be a brutal home invasion. The initial evidence seemed to support the twins' story. The house showed signs of forced entry, suggesting that an intruder had broken in and killed Nikki. The brutality of the attack also suggested that it might have been committed by someone with a personal grudge against the victim. But as the investigation progressed, inconsistencies began to emerge in the twins' story. Their timeline of events didn't match the evidence at the scene. Their behavior during questioning was also suspicious. They seemed more concerned with establishing their innocence than with finding their mother's killer. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered surveillance footage from the neighborhood. The footage showed the twins leaving the house on the morning of the murder, but it also showed them returning home before they claimed to have discovered the body. This discrepancy in their story was the first concrete evidence that they were not telling the truth. Faced with this evidence, the twins began to change their story. They admitted that they had been home when their mother was killed, but they claimed that they had been in another part of the house and hadn't seen or heard anything. They suggested that their mother might have been killed by one of her boyfriends or by someone she had met at work. But the evidence continued to mount against them. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed that the attack had been committed by someone who was familiar with the layout of the house. The killer had known where to find the knife and had been able to move through the house without leaving the kind of evidence that a stranger would leave. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. When the twins were brought to the police station for questioning, investigators noticed that they both had injuries on their bodies. These injuries were consistent with having been in a violent struggle, and they matched the defensive wounds that would have been inflicted by someone fighting for their life. In May 2010, after months of investigation and mounting evidence, the twins were arrested and charged with their mother's murder. The case made national news, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the ages of the perpetrators and their relationship to the victim. The twins initially maintained their innocence, but as the evidence continued to build against them, they eventually confessed to the crime. In separate interviews, they provided detailed accounts of what had happened on the morning of January 13, 2010. Their confessions were chilling in their matter-of-fact tone and their lack of remorse. The twins described how they had planned the murder in the aftermath of their latest argument with their mother. They had decided that they couldn't continue living with her, and they had chosen the most extreme possible solution to their problem. They had decided to kill her. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the fact that the twins were minors at the time of the crime. While they were tried as adults, they were not eligible for the death penalty. The prosecution sought life sentences, arguing that the brutality of the crime and the lack of remorse shown by the defendants warranted the harshest possible punishment. In January 2014, both twins pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. Tasmiyah was sentenced to 30 years in prison, while Jasmiyah received a similar sentence. The sentences were designed to ensure that they would not be eligible for parole until they were middle-aged, by which point it was hoped that they would have gained some perspective on the magnitude of their crime. The case of the Whitehead twins has become a study in the complex dynamics of family dysfunction and the tragic consequences of unresolved conflict. It raises difficult questions about the role of the court system in family disputes and the limits of what can be achieved through legal intervention in dysfunctional family situations. For the community of Conyers, the case was a reminder that even the most apparently stable and prosperous neighborhoods can hide dark secrets. The gated subdivision where the Whitehead family lived was supposed to be a safe haven, but it became the site of one of the most shocking crimes in the area's history. For the family members who survived, including Della Frazier, who had tried for years to hold the family together, the case was a source of profound grief and unanswered questions. They were left to wonder if there was anything they could have done to prevent the tragedy and to mourn the loss of not just one life, but effectively 3 lives destroyed by one moment of uncontrolled rage. Today, the Whitehead twins remain in prison, serving their sentences and living with the consequences of their actions. They are no longer the angry teenagers who committed this brutal crime, but they are still defined by what they did on that January morning in 2010. Their story serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of family dysfunction and the tragic consequences of unresolved conflict. The case of Jarmika, Nikki Whitehead and her twin daughters is one that reminds us of the fragility of family relationships and the importance of addressing problems before they spiral out of control. It is a story that will continue to be studied and discussed by criminologists, psychologists, and anyone interested in understanding the complex dynamics of family violence. As we close this case, we are left with more questions than answers. Could this tragedy have been prevented? What role did the court system play in creating the conditions that led to this crime? And what lessons can be learned from this case that might help prevent similar tragedies in the future? These are questions that don't have easy answers, but they are questions that we must continue to ask if we are to make sense of cases like this one. The story of the Whitehead family is a reminder that behind every crime statistic is a human story of pain, loss, and the complex dynamics that can drive people to commit acts of unimaginable violence. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we're traveling to sunny San Diego County, California, where 2 separate disappearances would eventually reveal a chilling connection that would forever change how communities think about safety and the justice system. This is the story of Amber Dubois and Chelsea King, 2 young women who never knew each other in life, but whose tragic deaths would be forever linked by one man's uncontrollable violence. It's a story that exposes the cracks in our system, the power of community action, and the devastating impact of ignored warning signs. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the families of Amber and Chelsea, whose strength in the face of unimaginable loss helped create lasting change. This story contains difficult subject matter, but it's told with respect for the victims and their loved ones. February 13, 2009 started like any other Friday morning in Escondido, California. 14-year-old Amber Dubois was preparing for what should have been an exciting day at school. She had a $200 check folded carefully in her pocket, money she'd saved to purchase a pet lamb through her high school's agricultural program. For Amber, this wasn't just any ordinary purchase, it represented months of planning and saving, a project she was genuinely excited about. Amber lived with her mother, Carrie Cave, in a modest home in Escondido. She was described by friends and family as a responsible, caring teenager who had a special connection with animals. The lamb project was perfectly suited to her personality. She wanted to raise and care for the animal as part of her studies at Escondido High School. That morning, Amber left her house at approximately 7 a.m., walking the familiar route to school she'd taken countless times before. The path took her along busy Escondido Boulevard, past strip malls and residential neighborhoods. It was a route many students used daily, considered safe by most parents in the community. But Amber never made it to school that day. When she failed to arrive for her first class, school officials followed standard protocol, calling home to report her absence. Carrie Cave was immediately alarmed. Amber was not the type of student to skip school, especially not on a day when she had something as important as her lamb purchase planned. The initial response from authorities was frustratingly routine. Like many missing teenager cases, there was an assumption that Amber might have simply run away. Teenage runaways were common, and without immediate evidence of foul play, the investigation began with standard procedures, checking with friends, examining her social media presence, and waiting to see if she would return home on her own. But Carrie Cave knew her daughter. She knew that Amber wouldn't simply disappear without explanation, especially not when she had her precious $200 check and plans for her lamb. Cave immediately began her own search efforts, posting flyers throughout the community and organizing volunteer search parties. The case quickly gained local media attention. Amber's photo, a smiling teenage girl with long brown hair and bright eyes, began appearing on news broadcasts and in newspapers throughout San Diego County. The community of Escondido rallied around the family, with hundreds of volunteers joining search efforts that covered miles of terrain around the area where Amber was last seen. As days turned into weeks, the search for Amber Dubois became one of the most extensive missing person investigations in San Diego County history. Search teams combed through canyons, parks, and undeveloped areas. They followed up on hundreds of tips and leads, each one raising hopes that would ultimately be dashed. The investigation revealed some troubling details about Amber's last known movements. Witnesses reported seeing a teenager matching her description walking along Escondido Boulevard around 7:15 a.m., but after that, she seemed to vanish completely. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses to an abduction, and no clear evidence of what had happened to her. While the search for Amber Dubois continued, a dangerous predator was already walking among the communities of San Diego County. John Albert Gardner III had already spent 5 years behind bars for sexually assaulting and beating his 13-year-old neighbor. His criminal history should have been a red flag, but the system had failed to properly assess and contain the threat he represented. Gardner's path to violence began years before he would encounter Amber or Chelsea. Born in 1979, he grew up in a troubled household that friends and family would later describe as chaotic. His early life was marked by instability, behavioral problems, and warning signs that would go largely unaddressed. In 2000, when Gardner was 21 years old, he committed his first serious violent offense. He brutally attacked a 13-year-old neighbor girl, beating and sexually assaulting her in an attack that shocked the community. The assault was particularly heinous. He had lured the young girl to a secluded area before attacking her with extreme violence. During his trial for this assault, something remarkable happened that would later seem prophetic. A forensic psychiatrist in that case evaluated Gardner and made a chilling assessment. The psychiatrist warned that Gardner posed a significant danger to society, particularly to young women and girls. This wasn't a casual observation. It was a professional opinion based on extensive evaluation of Gardner's psychological profile. Even more disturbing, Gardner himself seemed to recognize his dangerous tendencies. In various interviews and assessments, he repeatedly admitted that he was a threat to society. John Albert Gardner repeatedly admitted he was a danger to society. He expressed concerns about his own violent impulses and his inability to control them. These warnings should have resulted in more intensive monitoring and intervention. Instead, Gardner was sentenced to 6 years in prison for the assault on the 13-year-old girl. He served 5 years before being released on parole in 2005. His parole conditions included registration as a sex offender and various restrictions on his movements and activities. But the parole system failed. Gardner's supervision was inconsistent, and he was able to move freely throughout San Diego County without the intensive monitoring that his psychological profile suggested was necessary. He found employment, maintained an apartment, and to outside observers, appeared to be successfully reintegrating into society. What authorities didn't realize was that Gardner's violent impulses hadn't been addressed by his time in prison. If anything, his hatred and rage had intensified. He was a ticking time bomb, and the system that was supposed to protect society from him was failing at every level. By early 2009, Gardner was living in the San Diego area, working various jobs and maintaining the appearance of a reformed individual. But inside, he was planning and fantasizing about violence. The predatory behaviors that had led to his first conviction were escalating, and he was actively seeking opportunities to attack vulnerable victims. On that Friday morning when Amber Dubois left her house with her $200 check, she had no way of knowing that she would cross paths with John Gardner. The exact circumstances of their encounter would remain unknown for over a year, but Gardner would eventually confess to the horrific details of what happened that day. According to Gardner's later confession, he was driving through Escondido that morning when he spotted Amber walking along the boulevard. Something about her, perhaps her youth, her vulnerability, or simply the fact that she was alone, triggered his predatory instincts. He pulled over and approached her. Gardner lured Amber Dubois with the threat of a knife. The initial contact was likely brief. Gardner would have used his size and the weapon to quickly gain control of the situation. Amber, faced with immediate physical threat, would have had little choice but to comply with his demands. Gardner forced Amber into his vehicle and drove her to a remote location. What followed was every parent's worst nightmare. Gardner admitted to kidnapping, raping, and stabbing Amber to death in February 2009. The attack was swift and brutal, driven by Gardner's rage and his complete lack of empathy for his victim. The violence Gardner inflicted on Amber was extreme. This wasn't a crime of opportunity that escalated beyond his control, it was a planned, predatory attack by someone who had been fantasizing about violence for years. Gardner later described feeling a sense of power and control during the attack, emotions that fed into his psychological need to dominate and destroy. After murdering Amber, Gardner faced the challenge of disposing of her body. He drove to a remote, mountainous area in northern San Diego County, far from where he had abducted her. The location was chosen specifically because it was isolated and unlikely to be discovered by hikers or other visitors. Gardner buried Amber's body in a shallow grave, covering it with rocks and debris in an attempt to hide the evidence of his crime. He then returned to his normal routine, going to work and maintaining his daily activities as if nothing had happened. This ability to compartmentalize and return to normal behavior after committing such a horrific act demonstrated the calculating nature of his personality. Meanwhile, the search for Amber continued. Her family, friends, and hundreds of volunteers were scouring the area where she was last seen, unaware that her killer had already moved her body far from the search zone. The massive volunteer effort, while unsuccessful in finding Amber, demonstrated the power of community response to tragedy. For over a year, the disappearance of Amber Dubois remained one of San Diego County's most perplexing missing person cases. Her mother, Carrie Cave, refused to give up hope, organizing search parties and keeping Amber's case in the public eye through media appearances and community events. The investigation consumed enormous resources. Detective teams followed hundreds of leads, some promising, others clearly false. They investigated potential sightings of Amber in locations throughout California and beyond. Each lead required careful follow-up, and each dead end brought fresh disappointment to the family and investigators. Cave became a vocal advocate for missing children, using her tragedy to help other families facing similar situations. She worked with local and national missing children organizations, sharing her experience and pushing for improvements in how authorities respond to missing person cases. The media attention around Amber's case was extensive but gradually decreased as months passed without new developments. This is a common pattern in missing person cases, initial intensive coverage that slowly fades as the story becomes old news. Cave fought against this tendency, continuing to seek media attention and public awareness about her daughter's case. During this time, Gardner was living freely in the San Diego area, working various jobs and maintaining the appearance of a reformed individual. He was required to register as a sex offender, but his compliance with these requirements was sporadic and poorly monitored. The parole system that was supposed to track his movements and activities was failing to provide adequate supervision. Unknown to authorities, Gardner's violent tendencies were escalating. His successful attack on Amber had fed his fantasies and given him confidence in his ability to abduct and murder victims without being caught. He began planning future attacks, scouting locations and potential victims throughout San Diego County. 17-year-old Chelsea King was everything a parent could hope for in a teenager. A senior at Poway High School, she was an honor student, a varsity cross-country runner, and a volunteer in her community. Chelsea had already been accepted to San Diego State University, where she planned to study psychology and eventually work with children. Chelsea lived with her parents, Brent and Kelly King, in the affluent suburb of Poway. She was described by friends and teachers as mature, responsible, and genuinely caring about others. Her involvement in cross-country running wasn't just athletic, she saw it as a way to maintain her physical and mental health, and she often encouraged others to join her in running activities. The King family was close-knit and supportive. Brent King, Chelsea's father, was particularly proud of his daughter's achievements and her plans for the future. The family regularly spent time together, and Chelsea was open with her parents about her activities and friendships. Chelsea's passion for running had led her to explore various trails and parks throughout San Diego County. She was familiar with Rancho Bernardo Community Park, a popular recreational area that featured miles of hiking and running trails around Lake Hodges. The park was considered safe, frequently used by families, joggers, and outdoor enthusiasts. On February 25, 2010, Chelsea had plans to visit the park to scout running routes. She was considering participating in a cross-country event that would take place in the area, and she wanted to familiarize herself with the terrain. It was the kind of responsible preparation that characterized Chelsea's approach to everything she did. That Thursday afternoon, Chelsea drove to Rancho Bernardo Community Park in her car. She parked in the main lot and began her run along the well-established trail system. The area was popular with other runners and hikers, and Chelsea felt safe exercising there alone. On February 25, 2010, 17-year-old Chelsea King went for a run at Rancho Bernardo Community Park in San Diego, California. It was a decision that would cost her life and finally expose John Gardner's pattern of violence. Gardner had been in the area that day, possibly stalking potential victims or simply taking advantage of an opportunity when he encountered Chelsea. The park's trail system, while popular, had isolated sections where a predator could attack without being immediately discovered. According to Gardner's later confession, he approached Chelsea on the trail and immediately escalated to violence. Gardner admitted in court that he attacked her and dragged her to a remote area where he raped and strangled her within an hour. The speed and brutality of the attack demonstrated Gardner's experience and planning. He admitted to dragging Chelsea to a remote area around Lake Hodges, where he went on to rape, strangle, and bury her there in February 2010. The location was chosen because it was isolated from the main trail system, reducing the chance of discovery during the attack. Unlike his encounter with Amber Dubois, Gardner's attack on Chelsea King left behind physical evidence. During the struggle, Gardner lost clothing items that would later become crucial evidence in his identification and arrest. He buried her in a shallow, lakeside grave, but the location was not as remote as where he had disposed of Amber's body. After killing Chelsea, Gardner attempted to return to his normal routine. However, the discovery of Chelsea's abandoned car in the park parking lot quickly triggered a massive search and investigation that would prove more intensive and immediate than the response to Amber's disappearance. When Chelsea King failed to return home from her run, her family immediately contacted authorities. Unlike the initial response to Amber's disappearance, law enforcement treated Chelsea's case as a potential abduction from the beginning. Several factors contributed to this more aggressive response: Chelsea's reliable character, the discovery of her abandoned car, and lessons learned from other missing person cases. The search for Chelsea was massive and immediate. Hundreds of volunteers joined professional search teams in combing the area around Lake Hodges. The search effort was coordinated and systematic, using dogs, helicopters, and ground teams to cover thousands of acres of terrain. During the search, investigators discovered crucial evidence. Chelsea's underwear was found, and not only were they confirmed to be King's, but a second DNA sample on the underwear was linked to registered sex offender John Gardner. This physical evidence provided the breakthrough investigators needed to identify their suspect. DNA tied Gardner to the scene, and he was arrested on Sunday, February 28 for Chelsea's rape and murder. Gardner was arrested 3 days later outside a Mexican restaurant in suburban Escondido. The arrest was the culmination of intensive investigative work that had connected physical evidence to Gardner's identity through the sex offender database. As the search continued for Chelsea's body, Gardner claims he was ready to confess to the murders of both girls. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence and the certainty of conviction, Gardner made the calculated decision to cooperate with authorities. His confession revealed the connection between the two cases that had eluded investigators for over a year. Though the two young girls never knew each other in life, they were linked in death when it was discovered that they had been abducted and murdered by the same man, John Gardner. Gardner's confession led authorities to Amber's remains. Her skeletal remains were later recovered by police in March 2010, after the police had questioned Gardner about her murder. The discovery brought closure to her family's year-long search while confirming the worst fears about her fate. John pleaded guilty to the murder and rape of Amber and Chelsea on April 16, 2010. He also pleaded guilty to attempting to rape Candice Moncayo in December 2009. The plea agreement spared him from execution but ensured he would never be released from prison. Gardner was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole on May 15, 2010, for raping and killing Escondido teenager Amber Dubois and Poway teenager Chelsea King. The cases of Amber Dubois and Chelsea King exposed critical failures in the criminal justice system and led to significant reforms in how sex offenders are monitored and supervised. Their deaths were tragic and preventable, but their families' advocacy has helped protect other potential victims. The story of these two young women reminds us that behind every true crime case are real people with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them. Amber and Chelsea's lives were cut short by preventable violence, but their memory continues to inspire efforts to create a safer world for all young people. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. The evening of March 13, 2010, was supposed to be just another Saturday night in Sacramento, California. The spring air carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the quiet streets of Citrus Heights, where young professionals and families lived their ordinary lives behind well-kept lawns and ceramic garden gnomes. But in one apartment on this peaceful street, something extraordinary and terrible was about to unfold. Monica Anderson, 26 years old with long brown hair and a smile that could light up a room, had no idea that this would be her last night on Earth. In just a few hours, her life would be cut short in the most brutal way imaginable, stabbed 91 times by someone she trusted, someone she loved, someone she had tried to help. This is the story of Monica Anderson, and how a relationship built on compassion and hope became a nightmare of drugs, jealousy, and uncontrollable rage. It's a story that will take us through the complexities of human relationships, the dark side of addiction, and the tragic consequences when love turns to obsession. To understand how this story ends, we must first understand how it began. Monica Anderson was not just a victim of crime, she was a real person with dreams, hopes, and a life full of potential. Born in 1984, Monica grew up in a loving family that had faced its share of challenges. Her biological father was not part of her life, but she found a strong father figure in her stepfather, Bill, who treated her as his own daughter from the moment he married her mother. Monica was the kind of person who made friends easily. She had a way of making people feel comfortable, of making them feel like they mattered. Those who knew her describe her as funny, caring, and generous to a fault. She was always the one offering to help friends move, the one who would drive across town to bring you soup when you were sick, the one who would listen to your problems at 3 in the morning without complaint. By 2009, Monica was working and living in the Sacramento area. She was one of those people who seemed to have it together on the surface. She had a job, her own place, and a circle of friends who loved her. But like many people in their 20s, Monica was still figuring out who she was and what she wanted from life. It was through this friend group that Monica first met Lon Onlu. The year was 2009, and Lon was just 19 years old, 7 years younger than Monica. Where Monica was warm and outgoing, Lon was more reserved, more complicated. Born to Vietnamese immigrant parents, Lon had grown up in a strict household where expectations were high and mistakes were not easily forgiven. The first time their friends introduced them, Monica was immediately drawn to Lon. There was something about the younger woman that tugged at Monica's protective instincts. Perhaps it was the way Lon seemed to carry herself with a mixture of vulnerability and defiance, or maybe it was simply that Monica saw someone who needed the kind of unconditional support that she was so good at providing. Lon was at a crossroads in her life. She was struggling with her identity, with her relationship with her family, and with finding her place in the world. For someone like Monica, who had a natural instinct to help others, Lon represented someone who needed saving. It was a dynamic that would define their relationship from the very beginning. The friendship between Monica and Lon began innocently enough. They would meet up with their mutual friends, hang out at local coffee shops, and slowly, Monica began to see the person behind Lon's guarded exterior. When Lon was comfortable, she could be funny and charming. She was intelligent and had a way of seeing the world that was both cynical and surprisingly insightful. But even in those early days, there were warning signs that Monica either didn't see or chose to ignore. Lon could be moody, prone to sudden shifts in temperament that left friends walking on eggshells. She had a history of troubled relationships and seemed to attract drama wherever she went. Some of Monica's friends worried about the influence Lon might have on her, but Monica was determined to be the good influence in Lon's life. As weeks turned into months, Monica and Lon's friendship deepened. They began spending more time together, just the two of them, away from the larger group of friends. It was during this time that their relationship began to shift from friendship to something more complicated. The exact nature of their relationship would later become a point of discussion in the courtroom, but what is clear is that Monica cared deeply for Lon, and Lon had become emotionally dependent on Monica in ways that were not always healthy. By late 2009, Monica had made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. Lon was having problems at home, struggling with her family's expectations and her own identity. She needed a place to stay, and Monica, true to her caring nature, offered her spare room. It seemed like a simple act of kindness, the kind of thing that Monica had done for friends many times before. But this time would be different. This time, Monica was inviting into her home someone whose emotional instability and growing drug problems would gradually transform her sanctuary into a prison. The first few weeks of living together were actually quite pleasant. Monica's apartment was a cozy one-bedroom in a quiet complex in Citrus Heights, and having Lon there made it feel more like a home. They would cook dinner together, watch movies, and talk late into the night about their dreams and fears. For Monica, it felt like she was finally making a real difference in someone's life. For Lon, it was the first time in a long time that she felt truly accepted and cared for. But as any roommate will tell you, living with someone is very different from being their friend. The small quirks and habits that seem endearing when you visit once a week become sources of friction when you encounter them every day. More importantly, when you live with someone, you can't hide your problems as easily. You can't pretend to be the person you think they want you to be when they see you every morning, every evening, and every moment in between. For Lon, this constant proximity began to reveal the depth of her emotional struggles. She was dealing with depression, anxiety, and a growing sense of inadequacy that manifested in unpredictable ways. Some days she would be the charming, intelligent woman that Monica cared about. Other days, she would be moody, withdrawn, and prone to angry outbursts over minor inconveniences. Monica, ever the optimist, believed that love and patience could help Lon through these difficult times. She would make excuses for Lon's behavior, both to herself and to their friends. When Lon was rude to friends who came to visit, Monica would explain that she was just having a bad day. When Lon would disappear for hours without explanation, Monica would worry but not confront her directly. She was walking on eggshells in her own home, but she told herself it was temporary, that things would get better. But as the months passed, things did not get better. They got worse. Much worse. The first major red flag came when Monica began to notice that money was going missing from her purse. At first, she thought she was just misremembering how much cash she had, but as the pattern continued, she couldn't ignore the obvious explanation. When she finally confronted Lon about it, the response was explosive. Lon denied it vehemently, accusing Monica of not trusting her and of being paranoid. She turned the conversation around, making Monica feel guilty for even bringing it up. This pattern would repeat itself many times over the months that followed. Monica would notice something troubling, money missing, strange behavior, signs that Lon was using drugs, and when she tried to address it, Lon would become defensive and manipulative, making Monica feel like she was the one in the wrong for being concerned. Because make no mistake, Lon was using drugs. What had started as occasional recreational use had escalated into something much more serious. She was using cocaine regularly, and the drug was exacerbating her already unstable emotional state. When she was high, she could be manic and unpredictable. When she was crashing, she was depressed and sometimes violent. Monica was not a drug user by nature, but living with Lon meant being exposed to this world whether she wanted to be or not. Sometimes, in an effort to connect with Lon or to not seem judgmental, Monica would use drugs with her. These were decisions that went against her natural instincts, but she was so committed to helping Lon that she was willing to compromise her own values. The drug use also meant that there were frequently strangers in Monica's apartment. Drug dealers, other users, and various hangers-on would show up at all hours, turning her peaceful home into a chaotic social hub. Monica's friends began to worry about her. They could see that she was changing, that the stress of living with Lon was taking its toll. But when they tried to talk to her about it, Monica would become defensive, insisting that she was fine and that Lon just needed more time to get her life together. By the beginning of 2010, the situation had become unsustainable. Monica was exhausted from the constant drama and worried about the impact that Lon's behavior was having on her own life. She had begun to realize that her desire to help Lon was actually enabling her destructive behavior. After several particularly difficult weeks, Monica made one of the hardest decisions of her life. She asked Lon to move out. The conversation was difficult but necessary. Monica explained that she cared about Lon and wanted to remain friends, but that the living situation was not working. She offered to help Lon find another place to stay and promised that this didn't mean the end of their relationship. But Lon did not take the news well. She begged, pleaded, and when that didn't work, she became angry and accusatory. She accused Monica of abandoning her, of never really caring about her, of being selfish and cruel. But Monica held firm. She had reached her limit, and she knew that for both of their sakes, they needed to have some space. Lon reluctantly agreed to move out, but the process was drawn out and painful. She would pack some of her things and then find excuses to delay actually leaving. She would apologize and promise to change, only to repeat the same destructive behaviors within days. Finally, after weeks of this back and forth, Monica put her foot down. She told Lon that she needed to be completely moved out by a certain date, and that if she wasn't, Monica would have to involve the authorities. It was a harsh ultimatum, but Monica felt she had no choice. Lon moved out, but she didn't go far. She found a place to stay with other friends in the area, and she began what can only be described as a campaign to win Monica back. She would call constantly, send text messages, and show up at Monica's work uninvited. She would apologize, make promises, and beg for another chance. And sometimes, when Monica was feeling lonely or guilty about the way things had ended, she would give in to these overtures. This cycle of separation and reconciliation would continue for months. They would get back together, things would be good for a few weeks, and then the same problems would resurface. Monica would set boundaries, Lon would cross them, and they would break up again. Each time, the reconciliation became more difficult, and the breakups became more acrimonious. What Monica didn't realize was that with each of these cycles, Lon was becoming more desperate, more unstable, and more convinced that her life was not worth living without Monica. She was not just losing a girlfriend or a friend, she was losing the one person who had shown her unconditional love and acceptance. The idea of being permanently separated from Monica was becoming unbearable. By the beginning of March 2010, Monica was trying to stick to her decision to end the relationship once and for all. She had stopped taking Lan's calls, she had asked their mutual friends not to pass messages between them, and she was trying to move on with her life. But Lon was not ready to let go. She was becoming increasingly desperate, and in her desperation, she was beginning to contemplate options that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. March 2010 was a month of transition. Spring was beginning to make its presence known in Sacramento, with the first flowers blooming and the days growing longer. For most people, it was a time of renewal and hope. But for Monica Anderson, it was a time of growing unease and frustration. The repeated cycles of breaking up and getting back together with Lon had taken their toll on Monica. She was emotionally exhausted, and she was beginning to realize that her attempts to help Lon were actually making things worse for both of them. She had been seeing a therapist to help her process the complicated emotions she was feeling, and the message was clear: she needed to prioritize her own well-being and stop trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Monica had spent so much of her identity on being the helper, the one who was always there for others, that stepping back from that role felt like losing a part of herself. But she was beginning to understand that her relationship with Lon was not healthy for either of them, and that continuing it would only lead to more pain. The decision to cut off contact with Lon was not made lightly. Monica had been hoping that with time and space, Lon would get the help she needed and they could eventually be friends again. But the constant calls, the manipulation, and the dramatic gestures were making it impossible for Monica to move on. She realized that she needed to be firm, even if it meant being cruel. For Lon, Monica's decision to cut off contact was devastating. She had been clinging to the hope that if she just tried hard enough, if she just promised to change convincingly enough, Monica would take her back. The realization that this was not going to happen sent her into a spiral of depression and rage that she would never recover from. Friends who knew Lon during this time describe her as being increasingly unstable and unpredictable. She would swing between desperate sadness and angry resentment, often within the same conversation. She would talk about Monica constantly, alternating between declaring her love and expressing anger at being rejected. Some of her friends became concerned about her mental state, but none of them imagined the depth of her desperation. During this period, Lan's drug use escalated significantly. She was using cocaine more frequently and in larger quantities, and the drug was making her paranoid and aggressive. She would stay awake for days at a time, spiraling through increasingly irrational thoughts about Monica and their relationship. In her altered state, she began to believe that Monica was not just rejecting her, but actively plotting against her. The combination of heartbreak, drug use, and mental instability created a perfect storm of destructive emotions. Lon was not just sad about losing Monica, she was angry about being abandoned, paranoid about being betrayed, and desperate to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond her ability to manage. During the first week of March 2010, Lon made several attempts to contact Monica. She called her phone repeatedly, sent text messages, and even showed up at her apartment uninvited. Each time, Monica firmly but politely asked her to leave her alone. These rejections only intensified Lan's desperation. On March 8, 2010, Lon showed up at Monica's workplace. She caused enough of a scene that security had to be called, and Monica was forced to leave work early. That evening, Monica called some of her friends to ask for advice. She was beginning to feel genuinely afraid of Lan's increasingly erratic behavior, but she was also worried about her former friend's mental state. The next day, Monica made a decision that would later be seen as both compassionate and tragic. She called Lon and agreed to meet her for coffee. She hoped that by having a calm, rational conversation, she could help Lon understand that their relationship was over and that she needed to move on. It was a decision that came from Monica's inherent desire to help others, but it would prove to be a fatal mistake. The coffee meeting did not go as Monica had hoped. Lon was agitated and emotional, alternating between pleading for another chance and angrily accusing Monica of betraying her. The conversation lasted for over an hour, but by the end, nothing had been resolved. Monica left the meeting feeling more worried than ever about Lan's mental state, but she remained firm in her decision to end their relationship. Over the next few days, the calls and messages continued. Lon would call Monica at all hours, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, always desperate. Monica stopped answering her phone, which only made Lon more frantic. She began calling Monica's friends, begging them to convince Monica to talk to her. She even called Monica's mother, a conversation that left Monica feeling both angry and worried. By March 12, 2010, Monica had made a decision. She was going to get a restraining order against Lon. She had been reluctant to take this step because she didn't want to criminalize someone who was clearly struggling with mental health issues. But Lan's behavior had become so intrusive and threatening that Monica felt she had no choice. Unfortunately, Monica would never get the chance to file that restraining order. She had planned to go to the courthouse on Monday, March 15th. But by then, it would be too late. Saturday, March 13, 2010, started like any other weekend for Monica Anderson. She woke up in her apartment in Citrus Heights, made coffee, and spent the morning catching up on household chores. She had plans to go out with friends that evening, something she was looking forward to. After the stress of the past few weeks with Lon, she was ready to have some fun and feel like herself again. At around 2 p.m., Monica received a call from one of her friends, asking if she wanted to come over and help with preparations for a party that evening. Monica agreed, and she spent the afternoon at her friend's house, helping to prepare food and decorations. Those who were with her that day describe her as being in good spirits, laughing and joking with friends. There was no indication that she was worried about anything in particular. As the evening approached, more friends began to arrive for the party. It was a casual gathering, the kind of low-key social event that Monica enjoyed. They played music, shared stories, and for a few hours, Monica was able to relax and enjoy herself. But as the evening progressed, Monica's mood began to shift. She became quieter, more withdrawn, and her friends noticed that she was checking her phone more frequently. When they asked her what was wrong, she mentioned that she had been receiving calls from Lon all day. The calls were becoming more frequent and more urgent, and Monica was beginning to worry that something was seriously wrong. Around 8 p.m., Monica received a call from Lon that was different from the others. Instead of the usual crying or anger, Lon sounded calm, almost eerily so. She told Monica that she needed to see her, that it was important. She said that she had something to tell her, something that couldn't wait. Monica was hesitant to meet with her, but Lon was insistent. She said that if Monica didn't come, she would do something drastic. Monica was torn. She didn't want to encourage Lan's manipulative behavior, but she was also genuinely worried about her mental state. After talking it over with her friends, she decided to go to Lan's apartment for just a few minutes. She promised her friends that she would be back soon, and she asked them to call her if she didn't return by 10 p.m. The drive to Lan's apartment took about 20 minutes. Monica was nervous but determined to have a final conversation that would put an end to this cycle of drama once and for all. She planned to be firm but kind, to make it clear that their relationship was over but that she hoped Lon would get the help she needed. When Monica arrived at Lan's apartment, she found her in a state of agitation. Lan's eyes were dilated, suggesting that she had been using drugs, and her speech was rapid and sometimes incoherent. She immediately began talking about their relationship, about how much Monica meant to her, and about how unfair it was that Monica was abandoning her. Monica tried to stay calm and rational. She repeated what she had been telling Lon for weeks, that she cared about her but that their relationship was not healthy, and that they both needed to move on. She offered to help Lon find resources for drug treatment and mental health support, but she made it clear that this was the end of their romantic relationship. The conversation that followed was emotionally charged but remained relatively civil for the first hour. Lon would make emotional appeals, and Monica would respond with firm but compassionate responses. But as the night wore on, and as the drugs in Lan's system continued to affect her judgment, the conversation became more heated. Around 9:30 p.m., Monica tried to leave. She stood up and told Lon that she had said everything she needed to say, and that she was going back to her friends. But Lon blocked her path to the door. She became more agitated, demanding that Monica stay and continue the conversation. Monica, trying to avoid a confrontation, agreed to stay for a few more minutes. This was the moment when the situation began to escalate in a way that would prove to be irreversible. Lon began to pace around the room, talking increasingly rapidly about how Monica was destroying her life by leaving. She started to become more accusatory, suggesting that Monica had been using her and that she was now discarding her like garbage. Monica, who had been patient and compassionate throughout the evening, began to lose her composure. She told Lon that she was being manipulative and that this kind of behavior was exactly why their relationship couldn't work. She said that she was tired of being made to feel guilty for having boundaries, and that she was not responsible for Lan's problems. These words, spoken in anger and frustration, would prove to be the trigger that set off the chain of events that would end in tragedy. Lan's response was immediate and extreme. She began screaming at Monica, accusing her of being selfish and cruel. She said that Monica was the only person who had ever loved her, and that by leaving, Monica was essentially killing her. Monica, now frightened by Lan's extreme reaction, tried to leave again. But Lon grabbed her arm and pulled her back. The physical contact was brief, but it represented a line that had been crossed. Up until that moment, despite all the drama and emotional manipulation, Lon had never been physically aggressive with Monica. The situation continued to escalate. Lon began throwing things around the apartment, breaking dishes and slamming doors. Monica, now genuinely frightened, tried to call her friends to ask for help. But Lon snatched the phone from her hand and threw it against the wall, breaking it. At this point, Monica realized that she was in serious danger. She had been trying to help Lon, but she had misjudged the depth of her instability. She tried to reach the door, but Lon was blocking her path. For the first time in their relationship, Monica saw something in Lan's eyes that she had never seen before, a complete disconnection from reality, a look of someone who was capable of anything. The confrontation that followed was brief but brutal. Lon, in a drug-fueled rage, attacked Monica with a knife from the kitchen. The first stab was to Monica's chest, and it was immediately clear that this was not a moment of temporary insanity that would pass. Lon continued to stab Monica repeatedly, long after she was no longer able to defend herself. The attack was so brutal and sustained that investigators would later count 91 stab wounds on Monica's body. Many of these wounds were inflicted after Monica was already dead, suggesting that Lon had lost all control and was acting out of pure rage and desperation. The attack lasted for what must have felt like an eternity to Monica, but was probably over within minutes. When it was finished, Lon was left alone with the body of the woman she claimed to love, and the full weight of what she had done began to sink in. Monica Anderson, 26 years old, died on the floor of her former lover's apartment, surrounded by the blood and chaos of uncontrolled rage. The woman who had spent her life trying to help others had been killed by someone she had tried to save. The tragedy of her death was not just that it was violent and brutal, but that it was so entirely preventable. The immediate aftermath of the murder was a study in contrasts. While Monica Anderson lay dead on the floor of Lan's apartment, her friends at the party were becoming increasingly worried about her absence. She had promised to be back by 10 p.m., and when that time came and went without word from her, they began calling her phone. The calls went straight to voicemail, as the phone lay broken on the floor of the apartment where Monica had died. By 11 p.m., Monica's friends were genuinely worried. They knew about the situation with Lon, and they were afraid that something had happened. They drove to Lan's apartment, but when they knocked on the door, there was no answer. They could see that the lights were on, but they could not see into the apartment from the street. What they didn't know was that inside the apartment, Lon was in a state of complete shock. The drugs in her system, combined with the trauma of what she had done, had left her in a dissociative state. She was sitting on the floor next to Monica's body, covered in blood, trying to process what had happened. For hours, Lon sat with the body, occasionally speaking to it as if Monica could still hear her. She apologized repeatedly, explaining that she didn't mean for this to happen, that she was just so angry and scared. She promised to take care of Monica, to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. It was not until the next morning that Lon began to understand the reality of her situation. As the drugs wore off and the shock began to subside, she realized that she had killed the person she loved most in the world. The weight of this realization was crushing, and she briefly considered suicide. But ultimately, she decided to try to cover up the crime. Lon spent most of Sunday, March 14th, trying to clean up the apartment and dispose of evidence. She scrubbed the blood from the floor, washed the knife, and threw away her bloody clothes. She wrapped Monica's body in blankets and tried to figure out how to dispose of it. But Lon was not a criminal mastermind. She was a drug user in the middle of a psychological breakdown, and her attempts to cover up the crime were clumsy and ineffective. She left evidence everywhere, and her behavior was so erratic that it was only a matter of time before someone would discover what had happened. The discovery of Monica's body came on Monday, March 15th, the day that Monica was supposed to file for a restraining order. When Monica failed to show up for work that morning, her co-workers became concerned. They called her friends, who told them about her visit to Lan's apartment on Saturday night. One of Monica's friends, worried about her safety, went to Lan's apartment to check on her. When she knocked on the door, Lon answered, but she was clearly disturbed and agitated. She claimed that Monica had left on Saturday night and that she hadn't seen her since. But the friend could see blood on Lan's clothes and smell the odor of decomposition coming from the apartment. The friend immediately called the police, and within hours, the apartment was surrounded by law enforcement. When the police forced entry into the apartment, they found Monica's body wrapped in blankets in the bedroom. The scene was so violent and disturbing that several of the first responders needed counseling afterward. Lon was arrested immediately and charged with murder. She was found sitting in the living room of the apartment, still wearing bloody clothes, in a catatonic state. She did not resist arrest and did not speak to the officers who took her into custody. The news of Monica's death sent shockwaves through the community of friends who had known and loved her. For many of them, it was the first time they had been touched by such a violent crime. The fact that it was someone they had known and worried about who had committed the murder made it even more difficult to process. Monica's family was devastated by the news. Her mother and stepfather had been worried about her relationship with Lon, but they had never imagined that it would end in such a tragic way. The fact that Monica had been trying to help Lon, that she had died while trying to be compassionate, made her death even more heartbreaking. The community of Citrus Heights, which had always been a safe and quiet place, was also shaken by the brutality of the crime. Neighbors who had lived in the area for decades suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders and worrying about their safety. The randomness of the crime, the fact that it had happened so close to home, made everyone feel vulnerable. In the weeks following Monica's death, her friends and family struggled to understand how such a thing could have happened. They knew that Lon had been troubled, but they had never imagined that she was capable of such violence. They wondered if they could have done something to prevent it, if they had missed warning signs that might have saved Monica's life. These questions would haunt them for years to come, but the reality was that Monica's death was the result of a perfect storm of factors that came together in the most tragic way possible. The combination of Lan's mental illness, drug use, and emotional instability had created a situation where violence became inevitable. The investigation into Monica Anderson's murder was both straightforward and complex. From a forensic perspective, the evidence was overwhelming. Lon Onla had been found with the victim's blood on her clothes, in an apartment where the victim's body was decomposing. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife, was found in the apartment with both the victim's blood and the perpetrator's fingerprints on it. But from a legal and psychological perspective, the case was more complicated. The question was not whether Lon had killed Monica, but whether she was legally responsible for her actions. The brutality of the crime, the extent of the drug use, and Lan's mental state all raised questions about her ability to form intent and understand the consequences of her actions. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, the lead investigator on the case, had been working homicide for 15 years, but she had never seen a crime scene quite like this one. The sheer number of stab wounds, the brutality of the attack, and the fact that it had continued long after the victim was dead suggested a level of rage and loss of control that was extremely rare. The forensic evidence told a clear story. Blood spatter patterns on the walls indicated that the attack had been sustained and that the victim had tried to defend herself. The kitchen knife, which had been used as the murder weapon, showed signs of repeated use, consistent with the multiple stab wounds. DNA evidence from under Monica's fingernails indicated that she had scratched her attacker during the struggle, providing additional evidence linking Lon to the crime. But the most disturbing aspect of the forensic evidence was the nature of the wounds themselves. The medical examiner determined that Monica had died from a stab wound to the chest that had punctured her heart. This wound, which was among the first inflicted, would have been fatal within minutes. The other 90 stab wounds had been inflicted after Monica was already dead or dying, suggesting that Lon had continued to attack her long after she was no longer able to fight back. This pattern of overkill was significant from a legal perspective because it suggested that the crime was not just a moment of rage, but a sustained and deliberate attack. It indicated that Lon had not just lost control in a moment of passion, but had made a conscious decision to continue the attack even after achieving her goal of harming Monica. The toxicology report on Lan's blood revealed significant amounts of cocaine and alcohol in her system at the time of her arrest. This finding was not surprising, given what investigators had learned about her drug use in the months leading up to the murder. But it raised important questions about her mental state and her ability to form intent. The presence of cocaine in her system could explain the brutal nature of the attack. The drug is known to cause paranoia, aggression, and impaired judgment, all of which could have contributed to the violence. But it could also be seen as mitigation, suggesting that Lon was not in full control of her actions at the time of the murder. The investigation also revealed the extent of Lan's emotional dependence on Monica. Text messages recovered from both women's phones showed a pattern of increasingly desperate communication from Lon in the weeks leading up to the murder. She had sent hundreds of messages to Monica, many of them expressing love and desperation, others containing threats and accusations. One particularly disturbing message, sent just hours before the murder, read, "If I can't have you, no one can. You're destroying my life by leaving me. I would rather die than live without you." This message would become a key piece of evidence in establishing premeditation. Interviews with friends and family members painted a picture of a relationship that had been deteriorating for months. Monica's friends described her as being increasingly stressed and worried about Lan's behavior. They reported that she had been talking about getting a restraining order and had been avoiding Lan's calls and visits. Lan's friends, on the other hand, described her as being obsessed with Monica and unable to accept that their relationship was over. They reported that she had been using drugs more heavily in the weeks before the murder and had been talking about Monica constantly, sometimes in ways that were concerning. One of Lan's friends, who wished to remain anonymous, told investigators that Lon had said, "Monica thinks she can just throw me away like I'm nothing, but I'll show her what happens when you break someone's heart." This statement, made just days before the murder, would become another crucial piece of evidence. The investigation also revealed the tragic irony of Monica's death. On the day she was murdered, she had made an appointment to file for a restraining order against Lon. If she had lived just one more day, she might have had the legal protection she needed. But her compassionate nature, her desire to help Lon one last time, had led her to the apartment where she would die. Detective Rodriguez later said that this was one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Monica had recognized the danger she was in and had taken steps to protect herself, but her natural instinct to help others had overridden her survival instincts. It was a reminder of how domestic violence can trap victims in cycles of abuse and manipulation. The physical evidence from the apartment told its own story. The broken phone, the overturned furniture, and the blood spatter patterns all indicated that there had been a struggle before the attack. Monica had not been taken by surprise. She had tried to defend herself and had tried to escape. But she had been trapped in the apartment with someone who was determined to hurt her. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the investigation was the discovery of what Lon had done in the hours after the murder. Security cameras from the apartment complex showed her leaving the building multiple times on Sunday, March 14, to dispose of evidence. She had thrown away bags of bloody clothing and cleaning supplies, and had purchased new clothes to replace the ones she had been wearing during the murder. This behavior suggested that despite her claims of not remembering the details of the murder, Lon had been lucid enough to attempt to cover up her crime. It indicated a level of premeditation and consciousness of guilt that would be difficult to explain if she had been completely out of control during the attack. The investigation concluded that Monica Anderson had been the victim of a brutal and premeditated murder, carried out by someone who had been emotionally and psychologically dependent on her. The evidence was overwhelming, and the case against Lon Onlo was strong. But the legal proceedings that would follow would raise complex questions about responsibility, mental illness, and the nature of justice. The trial of Lon Onlo began on September 15, 2010, in the Sacramento County Superior Court. The case had attracted significant media attention, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because it raised important questions about domestic violence, mental illness, and the responsibility of society to protect vulnerable individuals. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Michael Chen, presented a case that was both straightforward and compelling. The evidence against Lon was overwhelming, and the brutality of the crime spoke for itself. Chen argued that this was a case of premeditated murder, committed by someone who could not accept the end of a relationship. In his opening statement, Chen told the jury, "This is not a case about mental illness or drug addiction. This is a case about a woman who decided that if she couldn't have Monica Anderson, no one could. The evidence will show that Lon Onlo planned and executed the brutal murder of a woman whose only crime was trying to help her." The defense, led by attorney Patricia Williams, faced a nearly impossible task. The evidence against her client was overwhelming, and the brutality of the crime made it difficult to generate sympathy. But Williams had decided to pursue a defense based on diminished capacity, arguing that Lan's mental illness and drug use had rendered her unable to form the intent necessary for first-degree murder. In her opening statement, Williams told the jury, "This is a tragedy that could have been prevented." Lon Onlo was a young woman struggling with severe mental illness and drug addiction. She was not a cold-blooded killer, but a person who was failed by a system that should have provided her with the help she needed. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the forensic evidence, the witness testimony, and the electronic communications that showed the progression of Lan's obsession with Monica. They called Monica's friends and family members to testify about the impact of her death and the fear that Lan's behavior had caused in the weeks leading up to the murder. One of the most powerful moments in the prosecution's case came when Monica's mother, Patricia Anderson, took the stand. Through tears, she described her daughter as a compassionate young woman who had always tried to help others. She told the jury about Monica's plans to file for a restraining order, and about her family's concerns about Lan's increasingly erratic behavior. Monica was not naive, Patricia Anderson said. She knew that Lon was dangerous. But she also couldn't bring herself to completely abandon someone who was clearly struggling. That compassion, that desire to help others, was what made her special. And it was what got her killed. The defense faced the challenging task of humanizing someone who had committed such a brutal crime. They called mental health experts to testify about Lan's psychological state, and they presented evidence of her troubled childhood and her struggles with addiction. They argued that the combination of mental illness, drug use, and emotional trauma had created a perfect storm that led to the murder. Dr. Robert Martinez, a forensic psychiatrist called by the defense, testified that Lan was suffering from severe depression and anxiety at the time of the murder. He argued that her drug use had exacerbated these conditions and had impaired her ability to think rationally. He suggested that while Lan was responsible for her actions, she was not fully in control of them. But the prosecution's rebuttal was powerful. They pointed to the evidence of premeditation, including the threatening text messages and the attempts to cover up the crime. They argued that regardless of Lan's mental state, she had made conscious decisions that led to Monica's death. The most damaging piece of evidence was the testimony of Lan's friend, who described the threatening statements Lan had made about Monica in the days before the murder. When asked about Lan's mental state during this time, the friend said, "She was angry, not crazy. She knew exactly what she was saying and what she was planning to do." The trial lasted for 3 weeks, and the jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching their verdict. On October 8, 2010, they found Lan guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with tears from Monica's family and friends, and stoic silence from Lan, who had shown little emotion throughout the trial. The sentencing phase of the trial was equally emotional. Monica's family members were given the opportunity to address the court and describe the impact of her death on their lives. Her mother spoke about the grandchildren she would never have, the milestones Monica would never reach, and the hole that her death had left in their family. "Lan didn't just kill Monica," Patricia Anderson said. "She killed our hopes, our dreams, and our future. She took away someone who had so much to give to the world, and she did it out of selfishness and spite. No amount of punishment can bring Monica back, but I hope that justice can at least prevent this from happening to another family." Lan was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, but she declined. Her attorney read a brief statement expressing remorse for the pain caused to Monica's family, but Lan herself remained silent. On October 15, 2010, Judge Sarah Thompson sentenced Lan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In her sentencing statement, Judge Thompson said, "This was a brutal and senseless crime that robbed the world of a young woman who had dedicated her life to helping others. The defendant's mental illness and drug addiction may explain her actions, but they do not excuse them." The conviction and sentencing of Lan brought some measure of closure to Monica's family and friends, but it could not bring back the woman they had lost. The trial had exposed the failures of the mental health system, the dangers of domestic violence, and the tragic consequences of untreated addiction. But it had also highlighted the importance of recognizing warning signs and taking action to protect vulnerable individuals. The murder of Monica Anderson was a tragedy that could have been prevented. It was the result of a perfect storm of factors: untreated mental illness, drug addiction, domestic violence, and a system that failed to provide adequate support for those who needed it most. But it was also a reminder of the dangers that can arise when compassion and good intentions are not balanced with appropriate boundaries and self-protection. In the years since Monica's death, her family has worked to honor her memory by advocating for better mental health resources and domestic violence prevention programs. They have established a foundation in her name that provides support for young women who are struggling with abusive relationships and mental health issues. Patricia Anderson, Monica's mother, has become a vocal advocate for restraining order reform. She argues that the current system makes it too difficult for victims to get the protection they need, and that more resources should be available for those who are trying to escape dangerous situations. "Monica was trying to do the right thing," Patricia Anderson says. "She was trying to help someone who was struggling, and she was trying to protect herself when she realized the danger she was in. But the system failed her, and she paid the ultimate price." The story of Monica Anderson is ultimately a story about the complexity of human relationships and the tragic consequences that can result when love becomes obsession, when help becomes enabling, and when compassion becomes a vulnerability that can be exploited by those who are struggling with their own demons. Monica Anderson was 26 years old when she died. She had dreams, aspirations, and a life full of potential. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, and someone's hope for the future. Her death was not just a statistic in the criminal justice system, it was the end of a life that had meaning and value. As we remember Monica Anderson, we are reminded of the importance of recognizing the warning signs of domestic violence, of providing support for those who are struggling with mental illness and addiction, and of creating a society where people like Monica can get the help they need before it's too late. The murder of Monica Anderson was a tragedy, but her legacy lives on in the work of those who are dedicated to preventing similar tragedies in the future. Her story serves as a reminder that we all have a responsibility to look out for one another, to provide support for those who are struggling, and to never forget the value of every human life. Monica Anderson died on March 13, 2010, but her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her and in the work of those who are committed to creating a safer world for everyone. Her story is a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, there is always hope for healing, for justice, and for a better future. This has been the story of Monica Anderson, a young woman whose life was cut short by violence, but whose memory continues to inspire others to work for a world where such tragedies are no longer possible. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we're traveling to Clayton County, Georgia, where in the spring of 2010, a 15-year-old girl named Candace Parchment would vanish into the night, setting in motion a heartbreaking case that would remain unsolved for over a year. This is a story about a young life cut tragically short, a mother's unwavering love, and how the written words of a teenage girl would ultimately solve her own murder. Candace Parchment was born into a world that wasn't always kind, but she carried within her the kind of bright spirit that seemed to illuminate even the darkest corners of her circumstances. At 15 years old, she was a sophomore at Forest Park High School in Clayton County, Georgia, a suburb south of Atlanta where dreams and harsh realities often collided. Candace lived with her mother, Kathy Hyatt, in a modest home where love was abundant even when everything else felt scarce. Kathy had worked tirelessly to provide for her daughter, and the bond between them was unmistakable. Those who knew them described their relationship as close-knit, with Candace often confiding in her mother about the complexities of teenage life. The young girl had dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of her neighborhood. She talked about her future with the kind of hope that only youth can possess, speaking of college, career possibilities, and the life she wanted to build. Her mother would later describe Candace as intelligent, creative, and deeply thoughtful, qualities that would become tragically significant as this story unfolds. Clayton County in 2010 was a community in transition, with pockets of prosperity neighboring areas struggling with poverty and crime. For teenagers like Candace, navigating this environment meant dealing with challenges that extended far beyond typical adolescent concerns. Yet despite these obstacles, Candace maintained her optimistic outlook, focusing on her education and the relationships that mattered most to her. In her diary, a leather-bound journal that would later become crucial evidence, Candace wrote about her hopes, fears, and daily experiences with the kind of honesty that only private pages can hold. She documented her thoughts about school, friendships, and the sometimes confusing world of teenage relationships. These entries painted a picture of a normal 15-year-old girl trying to make sense of her place in the world. But beneath the surface of Candace's everyday life, darker currents were beginning to stir. In the months leading up to her disappearance, she had begun to document experiences that would prove far more sinister than typical teenage drama. The winter of 2010 brought with it an incident that would forever change the trajectory of Candace Parchment's life. It was January, and the cold Georgia air seemed to carry with it an undercurrent of danger that the 15-year-old couldn't have fully comprehended at the time. According to what Candace would later record in her diary, she found herself in an abandoned house in her neighborhood, a place where teenagers sometimes gathered, away from the watchful eyes of adults. It was there that she encountered two young men who would become central figures in her tragic story, Marshy Hickman and Jermaine Robinson. The details of what happened in that abandoned house would remain hidden for years, locked away in Candace's private thoughts and committed to the pages of her diary. But the incident was serious enough to leave a lasting impression on the young girl, serious enough that she felt compelled to document it in detail. In her careful handwriting, Candace described how Hickman and Robinson had attempted to assault her in that dark, cold room. She wrote about how they had tried to remove her clothing, how one of them had struck her in the head during the struggle. The fear and confusion she felt during those moments came through clearly in her words, preserved forever in blue ink on lined paper. The attempted assault was traumatic enough on its own, but what made it even more disturbing was the fact that these weren't strangers who had targeted Candace. These were people from her own neighborhood, individuals she knew and had to continue encountering in her daily life. The psychological impact of such an experience on a 15-year-old girl cannot be overstated. Following the January incident, Candace's behavior began to change in subtle ways that her mother would later recall. There was a new cautiousness about her, a wariness that hadn't been there before. She seemed more selective about where she went and whom she spent time with. Her mother noticed these changes but, like many parents, attributed them to the normal evolution of teenage behavior. Candace continued to document her experiences in her diary, but now her entries carried a different weight. The carefree observations of high school life were interspersed with darker thoughts and concerns about her safety. She wrote about feeling watched, about the unease that had settled over her daily routine since the incident in the abandoned house. The months between January and April 2010 passed with a tension that seemed to build like storm clouds on the horizon. Candace went through the motions of her normal life, attending classes, spending time with friends, helping her mother at home, but those who knew her best began to sense that something had fundamentally changed. It was during this period that Candace made what would prove to be a crucial decision. She began documenting more details about her experiences with Hickman and Robinson. Perhaps she sensed that these records might be important someday, or perhaps writing about her fears was simply a way to process them. Whatever her motivation, these diary entries would eventually become the key to solving her own murder. April 28, 2010, began like any other spring day in Clayton County. The weather was mild, the kind of pleasant evening that might ordinarily have filled a teenager with thoughts of summer vacation and endless possibilities. But for Candace Parchment, this would be the last day of her young life, though neither she nor her mother could have imagined such a thing as the evening began. Candace had been home with her mother, Caffeine, sharing the kind of ordinary moments that families often take for granted. They had talked about her day at school, made plans for the weekend, and settled into their usual evening routine. To Caffeine, everything seemed normal. There were no warning signs, no indication that anything was amiss. But as the night wore on, something changed. For reasons that remain unclear to this day, Candace made the decision to leave her home. What prompted this decision? Was she meeting someone she knew? Had she received a phone call or message that convinced her to venture out into the darkness? These questions would haunt her mother and the investigators who would later work her case. Caffeine Hyatt would later describe the moment she realized her daughter was gone as one of the most terrifying experiences of her life. She had gone to check on Candace, perhaps to say goodnight or to ask her something, only to find her daughter's room empty. The window was open, and Candace was nowhere to be found. The immediate panic that sets in when a parent realizes their child is missing is indescribable. Caffeine began calling Candace's friends, hoping for a simple explanation. Perhaps her daughter had gone to visit someone and forgotten to mention it. But as the hours passed and the phone calls yielded no information, the terrible reality began to set in. By the early morning hours of April 29th, Caffeine knew she had to contact the police. Her 15-year-old daughter had vanished without a trace, without explanation, and without taking any of her belongings. This wasn't like Candace. She was a responsible teenager who stayed in touch with her mother, who wouldn't simply disappear without saying where she was going. The initial police response would later become a source of frustration and heartbreak for Candace's family. When Caffeine reported her daughter missing, the officers who took the report seemed to approach the case with a troubling assumption, that Candace had simply run away. Despite her mother's insistence that this behavior was completely out of character, the police appeared to classify the disappearance as a runaway situation rather than a potential crime. This initial response reflects a broader problem in how missing persons cases involving young people, particularly young people of color, are often handled by law enforcement. The assumption that a missing teenager has chosen to leave, rather than been taken or harmed, can result in crucial delays in investigation and a lack of urgency that can prove fatal. Kathy and Hyatt refused to accept this characterization of her daughter's disappearance. She knew Candace better than anyone, and she knew with absolute certainty that her daughter would never have chosen to leave home without explanation. This wasn't a rebellious teenager acting out, this was a young woman who had been forced to leave against her will, or who had been deceived into leaving by someone she trusted. As the sun rose on April 29, 2010, Candace Parchment had been missing for hours. Somewhere in Clayton County, a 15-year-old girl was facing the final moments of her life, and the people who might have been able to help her were treating her case as a routine runaway situation. The days following Candace's disappearance stretched into weeks, each one bringing fresh agony for her mother and a growing sense of dread about what might have happened. While law enforcement continued to treat the case as a runaway situation, Kathy and Hyatt refused to give up hope or cease her own investigation into her daughter's whereabouts. Kathy organized searches of the neighborhood surrounding their home, enlisting the help of friends, family members, and concerned community members. They combed through wooded areas, checked abandoned buildings, and followed every possible lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The image of a desperate mother searching for her missing child became a familiar sight in Clayton County during those terrible weeks. The community response was mixed. Some neighbors and friends rallied around the family, offering support and assistance in the search efforts. Others seemed to accept the police assessment that Candace had simply run away, perhaps believing that such things were common enough in their neighborhood that they didn't warrant special concern. This divided response added another layer of pain to an already unbearable situation. As weeks turned into months, the lack of progress in the case became increasingly difficult to bear. There were no witnesses to Candace's disappearance, no surveillance footage that captured her final moments, and no physical evidence that might indicate what had happened to her. The investigation, such as it was, seemed to have stalled almost before it began. Kathy's frustration with the police response grew with each passing day. She felt that her daughter's case wasn't being taken seriously, that the assumption of runaway status had created a self-fulfilling prophecy that prevented a thorough investigation. She began to wonder whether her daughter would have received different treatment if she had been white, if she had come from a different neighborhood, or if she had fit a different profile in the eyes of law enforcement. The psychological toll of having a missing child is something that's difficult to comprehend unless you've experienced it yourself. Every phone call might bring news about your loved one. Every knock at the door might be the police with an update. Every day that passes without answers brings both hope and despair, hope that your child is still alive somewhere, despair that they might never come home. During this period, Kathy began going through her daughter's belongings more carefully, looking for any clue that might shed light on what had happened. She read through school papers, examined social media accounts, and spoke with every friend and acquaintance she could identify. She was doing the detective work that she felt the police should have been doing. The summer of 2010 passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless searching. Kathy held on to hope, but as the months dragged on, she began to prepare herself for the possibility that her daughter might never come home alive. The not knowing was perhaps the worst part, the constant uncertainty about whether Candace was suffering somewhere, whether she was calling out for her mother, whether she was even still alive. It was during this period that Kathy began to focus more intently on the people in her daughter's life. She knew that teenagers didn't simply vanish without a trace. Someone, somewhere, had to know something about what had happened to Candace. She began to pay closer attention to the young people in their neighborhood, particularly those who had been friendly with her daughter. The investigation, meanwhile, remained frustratingly static. Without witnesses, evidence, or even a clear indication that a crime had been committed, the police seemed content to let the case remain classified as a runaway situation. This would prove to be a costly mistake, one that would delay justice for years and allow a dangerous individual to remain free in the community. As autumn approached, Caffeine faced the terrible reality that her daughter had been gone for months without a trace. The hope that had sustained her through the early days of the disappearance was beginning to give way to a different kind of determination, the determination to find out what had happened to Candace, no matter how long it took or how painful the truth might be. November 2010 brought with it the kind of crisp autumn air that normally signals the approach of the holiday season. For most families, this would be a time of anticipation and gathering, but for Caffeine Hyatt, it marked 7 months of not knowing what had happened to her daughter. She continued her search, continued her advocacy, and continued to hope against hope that Candace would somehow find her way home. It was during this time that investigators made a discovery that would change everything. In a wooded area not far from the Parchment family home, someone noticed something unusual beneath an old mattress that had been discarded among the trees. What they found there would answer some questions about Candace's fate while raising many others about who was responsible for her death. The remains were skeletal, indicating that they had been there for some time. The location was secluded enough that the body might have gone undiscovered for much longer if not for the chance observation of the discarded mattress. The area was within walking distance of where Candace had lived, suggesting that whoever had brought her there was familiar with the neighborhood. Investigators immediately suspected that the remains belonged to Candace Parchment. The location, the timing, and the circumstances all pointed to the missing teenager. Within a day, their suspicions were confirmed through identification procedures that brought an end to months of uncertainty while beginning a new phase of grief and investigation. The discovery of Candace's body revealed that she had been murdered, stabbed and strangled to death. The violence of her death was shocking, indicating that this had not been a crime of opportunity but rather something more deliberate and brutal. The 15-year-old girl had suffered tremendously in her final moments, a fact that would haunt her mother and the investigators who worked her case. For Caffeine Hyatt, the discovery brought a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. The months of not knowing had been torture, but learning that her daughter had been murdered, and had been lying so close to home all this time, brought its own special kind of pain. The hope that had sustained her through the search was replaced by a burning need for justice. The location of the body raised troubling questions about the initial police response to Candace's disappearance. If investigators had taken the case more seriously from the beginning, if they had conducted searches in the immediate area rather than assuming she had run away, would they have found her sooner? Would there have been more evidence to work with? These questions would continue to trouble everyone involved in the case. The physical evidence recovered from the scene was limited. 7 months in the elements had degraded much of what might have been useful to investigators. There were no clear fingerprints, no DNA evidence that immediately pointed to a suspect, and no witnesses who could provide information about how Candace had ended up in that wooded area. The case was now officially classified as a homicide, which meant that different resources and investigative approaches would be brought to bear. But the delay in reaching this classification had cost precious time and potentially valuable evidence. The investigators who took over the case found themselves working with very little to go on. Interviews with Candace's friends and acquaintances began in earnest, but many of the people who might have had information were teenagers themselves, individuals who might be reluctant to talk to police or who might not fully understand the significance of what they knew. The investigators had to navigate the complex social dynamics of teenage life while trying to solve a murder that had occurred months earlier. The discovery of Candace's body marked the end of one phase of the investigation and the beginning of another. But without clear evidence or witnesses, the case quickly stalled. The investigators found themselves with a murder victim but no clear path to identifying her killer. The case began to go cold, joining the ranks of unsolved homicides that frustrate law enforcement and devastate families. The investigation into Candace Parchment's murder quickly encountered the same obstacles that plague many homicide cases: a lack of witnesses, degraded physical evidence, and a victim who could no longer tell her own story. The months that passed after the discovery of her body were filled with investigative dead ends and false leads that seemed to lead nowhere. Detectives interviewed dozens of people who had known Candace, from close friends to casual acquaintances. They spoke with her teachers, her classmates, and the various young people who had been part of her social circle. Each interview provided small pieces of information about Candace's life, but none seemed to point toward a clear suspect or motive for her murder. The investigators also examined Candace's phone records, social media accounts, and any other digital footprints that might provide clues about her final days. They were looking for any indication of who she might have been planning to meet on the night she disappeared, or any sign of threats or conflicts that might have led to her death. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the lack of physical evidence from the crime scene. The 7-month delay between Candace's murder and the discovery of her body had allowed time and weather to destroy much of what might have been useful. Additionally, the location where her body was found appeared to be a secondary crime scene. She had likely been killed elsewhere and then transported to the wooded area. The investigators also had to contend with the reality that many potential witnesses in the case were teenagers who might be reluctant to speak with police. Some may have been involved in activities they didn't want to disclose, while others might have been afraid of retaliation if they provided information. The code of silence that sometimes exists in communities affected by crime can make it difficult for investigators to get the cooperation they need. As 2011 began, the case remained unsolved. The investigators had exhausted their initial leads and were beginning to face the possibility that Candace's murder might join the ranks of cold cases that remain forever unsolved. The lack of progress was devastating for her family and frustrating for the law enforcement officers who had worked so hard to find answers. Caffeine Hyatt refused to accept the possibility that her daughter's killer might never be identified. She continued to advocate for her daughter's case, reaching out to local media and trying to keep public attention focused on the unsolved murder. She believed that someone in the community knew what had happened to Candace, and she was determined to find that person. The anniversary of Candace's disappearance and murder brought renewed attention to the case, but it also highlighted how little progress had been made in identifying her killer. The investigators had developed theories about what might have happened, but theories without evidence are insufficient to solve a murder case. During this period, Caffeine began to focus more intently on her daughter's personal belongings, hoping to find some clue that might have been overlooked. She went through Candace's room systematically, examining every item, every piece of paper, every memento that might provide insight into her daughter's final days. The psychological impact of having an unsolved murder case is something that affects not just the victim's family but the entire community. There was a killer walking free in Clayton County, someone who had brutally murdered a 15-year-old girl and might be capable of striking again. This knowledge created an undercurrent of fear and unease that affected everyone who had known Candace. The investigators continued to work the case, but as more time passed, the likelihood of solving it seemed to diminish. Cold cases require fresh evidence or new witnesses to be reopened, and neither seemed forthcoming in Candace's case. The file remained open, but active investigation had essentially ceased. It was during this period of seeming hopelessness that Caffeine Hyatt made a decision that would ultimately change everything. She decided to pack up her daughter's belongings and move to a new home, unable to bear living in the place where Candace had spent her final days. This decision, made out of grief and necessity, would lead to the discovery that would finally bring justice for her daughter. In 2012, nearly 2 years after Candace's disappearance, Caffeine Hyatt faced the difficult task of packing up her daughter's belongings and moving to a new home. The house where she and Candace had lived together held too many memories, too much pain, and she needed a fresh start to begin rebuilding her life. The process of going through Candace's possessions was emotionally overwhelming. Each item, clothing, books, school papers, small trinkets, carried memories of the daughter she had lost. Caffeine approached the task systematically, trying to decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to preserve as memories of Candace's too short life. It was during this process that Caffeine made a discovery that would change everything. Tucked away among her daughter's belongings, she found something that investigators had somehow missed during their initial examination of Candace's room: her diary. The leather-bound journal had been hidden well enough that it had escaped notice during the chaos following Candace's disappearance. As Caffeine opened the diary and began to read her daughter's private thoughts, she initially expected to find the typical entries of a teenage girl, thoughts about school, friends, and the daily dramas of adolescent life. But what she discovered was far more significant, detailed accounts of experiences that would prove crucial to solving her daughter's murder. The diary entries were written in Candace's careful handwriting, and they painted a picture of a young woman who had been documenting troubling experiences in her life. The entries that would prove most significant were those describing the January 2010 incident in the abandoned house, where Candace had been assaulted by Marcy Hickman and Jermaine Robinson. Reading her daughter's words about the attempted rape was devastating for Caffeine, but she immediately recognized the significance of what she had found. Here, in Candace's own handwriting, was evidence of a violent crime that had occurred just months before her disappearance. The diary entries provided names, dates, and detailed descriptions of what had happened. Candace had written about how Hickman and Robinson had cornered her in the dark, cold room of the abandoned house. She described their attempts to remove her clothing, the physical violence that had occurred, and her fear during the assault. The entries were detailed enough to provide investigators with specific information about the crime and the perpetrators. But the diary contained more than just an account of the January incident. Candace had also written about her fears following the assault, her concerns about encountering Hickman and Robinson in the neighborhood, and her growing sense of unease about her safety. These entries suggested that the January incident was not an isolated event but rather part of a pattern of harassment or intimidation. Caffeine immediately contacted the police to report her discovery. The diary entries provided investigators with their first real lead in the case, names of individuals who had committed violent crimes against Candace and who might be connected to her murder. After nearly 2 years of dead ends, the case suddenly had new life. The investigators were stunned by the diary's revelations. Here was evidence of a violent crime that had occurred just months before Candace's murder, committed by individuals who lived in her neighborhood and who would have had ongoing contact with her. The connection between the January assault and the April murder seemed obvious, but they would need to prove it. The diary entries also highlighted another tragedy in the case. Candace had documented a violent crime against her, but she had never reported it to police or told her mother about it. This silence, common among victims of sexual assault, had prevented law enforcement from intervening before the situation escalated to murder. As investigators began to examine the diary more carefully, they realized that Candace had essentially solved her own murder. Her detailed accounts of the January assault provided them with clear suspects and a motive for her killing. The diary was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, the piece of evidence that would finally allow them to seek justice for the murdered teenager. The discovery of the diary also raised troubling questions about the initial investigation. If police had conducted a more thorough search of Candace's room when she first disappeared, would they have found the diary sooner? Could her murder have been prevented if the January assault had been reported and investigated at the time? Armed with the evidence from Candace's diary, investigators began the process of building a case against Marcy Hickman and Jermaine Robinson. The diary entries provided them with probable cause to arrest both men and to begin a more thorough investigation into their activities during the period leading up to Candace's murder. The arrests came more than 2 years after Candace's disappearance, a delay that had allowed both men to remain free in the community despite having committed violent crimes. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of their involvement in Candace's death and the events that led up to it. During interrogation, investigators confronted both men with the evidence from Candace's diary. The detailed accounts of the January assault, written in the victim's own handwriting, were difficult to deny or explain away. The diary entries provided specific details about the crime that only someone who had been there could know. The investigation revealed that the January assault had been a traumatic turning point in Candace's life. According to the diary entries, Hickman and Robinson had cornered her in the abandoned house and attempted to rape her. When she resisted, they had become violent, with one of them striking her in the head. The attack had been both physically and psychologically damaging for the 15-year-old girl. Following the assault, Candace had lived in fear of encountering her attackers again. The diary entries from the months between January and April painted a picture of a young woman who was constantly looking over her shoulder, worried about her safety, and struggling to process what had happened to her. The psychological impact of the assault had affected every aspect of her life. The investigation also revealed that Hickman and Robinson had continued to live in the same neighborhood as Candace following the January assault. This meant that she had to see them regularly, a situation that would have been incredibly stressful for a teenage victim of sexual assault. The constant reminders of her trauma may have contributed to her decision to leave home on the night of her disappearance. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Marshy Hickman was the primary suspect in Candace's murder. While both men had been involved in the January assault, the evidence suggested that Hickman had been the one who killed her. The motive appeared to be related to fears that Candace might report the assault to authorities or that she might testify against them if charges were filed. The case against Hickman was built primarily on the evidence from Candace's diary, supplemented by witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. The diary entries provided detailed accounts of the January assault and established a clear motive for murder. The prosecution would argue that Hickman had killed Candace to prevent her from reporting the assault or testifying against him. The legal proceedings that followed were emotionally difficult for Candace's family. Kathy and Hyatt had to relive the trauma of her daughter's death while also learning details about the assault that Candace had suffered months before her murder. The diary entries that had provided the key to solving the case also revealed the extent of her daughter's suffering. The trial process was lengthy and complex, involving multiple charges related to both the January assault and the April murder. Hickman faced charges of murder, aggravated assault, attempted rape, and concealing a death. The prosecution had to prove not only that he had killed Candace but also that he had done so to cover up the earlier assault. The defense argued that the diary entries were not sufficient evidence to prove murder, and that the connection between the January assault and the April disappearance was circumstantial. They challenged the reliability of the diary entries and questioned whether they provided enough evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. However, the prosecution was able to build a compelling case based on the diary evidence, witness testimony, and the circumstances surrounding Candace's disappearance. The diary entries were particularly powerful because they were written by the victim herself, providing first-hand accounts of the crimes committed against her. In 2013, after years of investigation and legal proceedings, Marshy Hickman was found guilty of murdering Candace Parchment. The jury deliberated on the evidence presented, including the crucial diary entries that had provided the breakthrough in the case. The conviction brought a measure of justice for Candace and her family, though it could never truly compensate for the loss of her young life. Hickman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the assault charges. The sentence reflected the severity of his crimes and ensured that he would never again be free to harm another person. For Kathy and Hyatt, the conviction provided some closure, though the pain of losing her daughter would never fully heal. The case of Candace Parchment raises important questions about how missing persons cases are handled, particularly those involving young people of color. The initial assumption that Candace had run away delayed the investigation and may have contributed to the loss of valuable evidence. Her case serves as a reminder of the importance of taking every missing person report seriously. The diary that solved Candace's murder also highlights the importance of thorough crime scene investigation. The fact that this crucial piece of evidence was initially overlooked demonstrates how small details can make the difference between solving a case and allowing it to go cold. Candace's own words became the key to bringing her killer to justice. The case also illustrates the broader issue of unreported sexual assault and the barriers that prevent victims from seeking help. Candace's decision not to report the January assault was understandable given her age and circumstances, but it also meant that law enforcement had no opportunity to intervene before the situation escalated to murder. For Kathy and Hyatt, the resolution of her daughter's case brought both relief and continued grief. While she was grateful that Hickman had been brought to justice, nothing could bring back her daughter or erase the trauma of the years spent searching for answers. The case had taken a tremendous toll on her family and community. The story of Candace Parchment serves as a reminder of the importance of believing victims, taking missing persons cases seriously, and conducting thorough investigations. It also highlights the resilience of families who refuse to give up in their search for justice, even when the system seems to fail them. Candace's diary not only solved her own murder but also gave her a voice that extended beyond her death. Her words became testimony that ensured her killer would be held accountable for his crimes. In a very real sense, Candace Parchment helped solve her own case and bring justice for herself. Today, Candace is remembered not just as a victim of violence but as a young woman whose courage in documenting her experiences helped bring a dangerous individual to justice. Her story serves as both a tragedy and a testament to the power of truth to prevail, even in the darkest circumstances. The case remains a sobering reminder that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life was cut short, a family forever changed by loss, and a community that must grapple with the reality of violence in their midst. Candace Parchment was 15 years old when she died, but her voice continues to speak through the pages of her diary, ensuring that her story will not be forgotten. Thank you for listening to tonight's True Crime Stories. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next True Crime Stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.